Chapter 1. Ruby sat in the corner of the mercantile in Nowhere, Texas, sewing a shirt for one of the cowboys in town. She'd made a deal with the previous owner of the store a year before when she'd first come to town, and the new owner was abiding by their arrangement. She had a small corner of the store to sew her shirts and sell them, only giving the owner a 10% commission, because she used the fabric from his store, and she brought in customers. She didn't enjoy sewing a great deal, but she was good at it, and she was willing to do what she needed to do to contribute to her and David's future. From her vantage point behind her sewing machine, where she was hand-sewing a buttonhole, she watched a couple arguing. The man had his hands on his hips. "I'm not going to have flowered curtains in the windows. They look girly. Why not good old red and white checked?" "Those are boring," his wife responded. "I want the flowers. They'll seem so cheerful in the winter. There's barely even a winter here. Did you forget we're in Texas now and not in Vermont?" "Of course, I didn't forget. I just know what I like and what I want, and those flowered curtains are it." She folded her arms across her chest. Watching them, Ruby wished her love, David, was close enough to argue with. He was still back in Orlan, New York, working hard to make enough money to send for her. She was expecting a train ticket any day, and then she would go home to him. She was ready to settle down and be a good wife to him. Watching the couple again, it made her wonder why people who loved one another enough to marry couldn't remember that love as they grew discontent with each other. Why couldn't they see past it and simply give in? The store owner, Louis Darcy, caught her eye, holding up a letter. Ruby's eyes locked onto it, and she hurried across the store to snatch the letter from his hand. Mr. Darcy had dark hair that had been allowed to grow too long, and piercing brown eyes. He was attractive in a very rugged way, but she had a heart only for her love, David. "I'm going to leave a few minutes early today, Mr. Darcy," she said, eyeing the letter in her hand. She wondered if it had her train ticket home. Mr. Darcy nodded. "That's fine, Ruby. Is that from your sweetheart?" She nodded. "It is." She hurried to her work area, tidying up quickly. She would walk home through the woods and find her favorite spot to sit and read the letter. Letter days made her happier than anything else ever could. She hugged it to her as she rushed from the store, her lunch pail in her hand. She found her favorite log in the wooded area between town and the house she lived in, to use as a bench. She shared the house with her sister and the kind but batty old lady who had adopted them, along with 13 other orphans the previous year. She quickly opened the letter and stifled her disappointment when a train ticket didn't fall out. No matter, though. He'd send for her soon. Her eyes fell to his familiar handwriting, the smile fading from her face almost immediately. "Dear Ruby, I need to tell you something that's hard for me, so I'm just going to get it over with. I'm marrying Maggie Barnes. You remember her from school, I'm sure. I'm not sure how it happened, but we started spending more and more time together, and I realized that I love her. We're going to be very happy together. I'm sure you'll find someone much better than me in Texas. I wish you all the best. David." She read the letter once more, praying for the words on the page to magically change. He'd promised to love her forever. Did he think forever only lasted for a year? She crumpled up the letter and tucked it into her pocket, dashing away a tear as she strode toward home. When she got to the house, she ran up the stairs to the room she shared with her sister, Opal. She threw herself face down on her bed, thankful the other girls weren't home from work yet. Minutes later, there was a knock on her door. "Ruby? Are you all right?" Ruby sighed. It was Edna Petunia, and while she was a good, loving woman, she wasn't Mrs. Hayes, and Cassie Hayes was the woman she really wanted to talk to. Mrs. Hayes had been the matron of the orphanage when she arrived there at the age of 5 with her twin, and had been as close to a mother as anyone Ruby had ever known. Just because she'd married didn't mean she meant less to Ruby. Edna Petunia walked into the room and sat on the bed beside Ruby. She patted her back. "Do you want to talk about it?" When Ruby shook her head, Edna pulled a peppermint stick from her cleavage. "Peppermint stick?" Ruby rolled her eyes. The crazy old woman thought peppermint sticks covered in the sweat from her bosom fixed everything. No. Cough tonic? Edna offered. Ruby turned and looked at her adoptive mother for the first time since she'd entered the room. Mrs. Hayes suspected that the cough tonic was nothing more than whiskey that Edna Petunia was trying to find a way to make socially acceptable. Was Edna Petunia really offering alcohol to a young innocent girl under her care? Mrs. Hayes would have a fit if she found out, but Ruby knew she'd never tell. She didn't want there to be enmity between the two women. Ruby shook her head. No, thank you. She sighed. I think I'm going to wander over to Mrs. Hayes's house and talk to her for a bit. Edna nodded. You do that. I know she's the closest thing to a mother you've ever had. It's not that I don't like you, Edna Petunia, I just need someone who really understands me. Edna waved her hand at Ruby. Don't worry about this crazy old woman. Go. Ruby hurried out of her room, wishing Mrs. Hayes lived a little closer. She was a 30-minute walk, and Ruby didn't want to have too much time to think. She couldn't help but dwell on David. Why would he give up on their love so quickly? On her way, she saw Louis Darcy walking along with his two boys. They were both in school, but just barely. When he saw her, he waved and walked over to her. So when am I going to lose you? Next week? Next month? Tomorrow? He'd made it clear that he didn't want her rushing off to New York to marry David. He wanted to keep her. Ruby all but cringed at his words. She didn't want to have to admit she'd been jilted to anyone, but especially him. I'll be staying in nowhere for the foreseeable future. He looked at her for a moment, surprise filling his eyes. Wait here, boys. He took her arm and guided her away from the road and out of earshot of his sons. What happened? She shrugged, knowing she couldn't avoid answering forever. Soon the whole town would know. David's marrying someone else. That's what was in the letter today? Louis asked, his face full of sympathy. Don't pity me. I'll live. Her voice came out harsher than she'd planned. It wasn't his fault David had moved on. I'm not pitying you. I'm thinking. He looked over at his boys, who had picked up sticks and were sword fighting with them. When I moved here, I told everyone I was a widower. My wife left me for another man. She just had their first baby. She doesn't even want anything to do with my boys. His mind raced as he tried to come up with the best way to word the proposition he had for her. Ruby frowned. His story was awful, but why was he telling her this? I'm sorry. I don't need your sympathy. He looked at her for a moment, struggling to find the right words. I need a mother for the boys. And a wife for me. Marry me. Then everyone will think it was your idea to break things off. He knew he was muddling things with his offer, but he didn't care. As long as he convinced her to accept his proposal, nothing else really mattered. He'd taken one look at her and known he wanted her in his bed. Marrying her was the only way to make that happen. What would you get out of it? She asked, shocked at what he was offering. I'd get someone to cook and keep house, a mother for my boys, and a woman to warm my bed. He watched her face carefully as he said the last part, not wanting there to be any misunderstandings. The marriage may not be for love, but it would be a real marriage in every sense of the word. Ruby blushed. You would expect me to share your bed? Right away? She wasn't sure she could do that, she barely knew him. I would. A big part of the reason I want to marry again is because I miss having marital relations. Whether or not he was supposed to admit it to a young lady, he didn't know. He knew she'd been in a serious relationship, though, so he assumed she would know what he was talking about. I couldn't do that, Mr. Darcy. I don't really know you. The idea of letting any man but David touch her that way was appalling. If she was honest with herself, even the idea of letting David touch her was awful. She would have done it, because it would have been her duty as his wife, but she was certain she could never enjoy it. Get to know me then. Go for a drive with me tonight. We'll have to take the boys, of course, but... He sighed. No, I need to find someone who will watch the boys. He wanted to kiss her, and he wouldn't be able to do that with the boys looking on, complaining about it. Ruby bit her lip. She didn't want to marry him, because she didn't know him. Maybe getting to know him better would change her mind. She did like the idea of no one knowing she'd been jilted though. My sister, Opal, will watch them, she offered before she could stop herself. Of course, she'd have to ask Opal, but if she wouldn't do it, one of the other girls would. If there were any advantages to growing up surrounded by 14 other girls, that was it. He grinned, thrilled she was willing to at least listen to his proposition. She'd talked about her fiancé, David, a lot, so he'd been unwilling to approach her with the idea of courtship. He couldn't let this opportunity pass, though. Sounds good. Should I drop them off with her when I come to get you in my buggy? He asked. He wished he had an automobile to take her out in, but they just weren't practical in nowhere. The roads were too rough. That's fine. Edna Petunia will enjoy them as well. He started to ask about Edna Petunia, but decided to wait until later. They had to have something to talk about during their buggy ride. I'll see you at 7 then. Does that work? Ruby checked the watch pinned to her dress. It was just after 5. Yes, that will be fine. She would have to hurry to talk to Mrs. Hayes before going home, but she could do it. She all but ran the rest of the way to the house Mrs. Hayes shared with her husband, knocking on the door as soon as she arrived. She almost laughed when she saw the older woman, so round with her first child she looked as if she was about to explode. Mrs. Hayes took one look at Ruby and opened her arms wide. Ruby stepped into them and hugged her. Do you have a few minutes to talk? She saw that Mrs. Hayes was making supper. I'll help cook. I'll let you help cook. Mrs. Hayes moved back to the stove where she was flipping the chicken she was frying. You mash the potatoes and talk. Ruby explained quickly about the letter she'd received, and surprised even herself when she talked about the offer she'd received from Lewis. She didn't mention that he'd insisted they would share a bed immediately, because she didn't feel like that was any of Mrs. Hayes's business. Let her assume what she would. I'm tempted, which is crazy, she finished. I don't want everyone to know I've been jilted. Mrs. Hayes frowned. How well do you know him? I don't like the idea of you marrying someone you barely know. Honestly, I don't like that idea either. We're going to go for a drive tonight while Opal watches his 2 boys. I want to get to know him better before I make a decision either way. You're young, Ruby, Mrs. Hayes told her. You don't have to get married tomorrow. Ruby shrugged. I feel like I'm a burden. Edna Petunia is wonderful, but she took on 15 of us. She did feel like she was in the way, but there was more to it than that. She needed to be on her own. Living with the older couple had been a blessing, but it was time for her to move on. Mrs. Hayes shook her head. Don't think that way. Edna Petunia and Cletus would keep all 15 of you forever if they thought they could keep you tied down that way. All right. I won't let that color my decision then. Good. I don't want you rushing into anything you're not certain of. I won't. Even as she said the words, she knew they weren't true. If she decided that Mr. Darcy could possibly be a match for her, she'd jump at the chance to get out of the house. Lewis was there promptly at 7, and Ruby opened the door to him and his boys. Opal was behind her, ready to take the boys off for some quiet time. Cletus had found some of his toys from when he was a boy in the attic for the 2 lads to play with, mumbling under his breath about being too young to be a grandfather. Ruby smiled at the 2 of them. I don't even know your names, she told them. The older boy, around 9, pointed to his chest with his thumb. I'm Robert. That's James. Both boys had dark hair and green eyes, giving them unusual looks. Nice to meet you both. Ruby felt like she should make an effort with the boys, in case she became their mother. Are you going to marry our pa? James asked. Ruby shrugged. I really don't know. Would you like it if I did? James studied her. I don't know. Would you be a nice ma? I don't know. I would try to be. I've never been a ma before. We'll help you learn to do it right, Robert informed her. Opal moved around Ruby, to the boys. You're spending the evening with me. I baked cookies. When the boys squealed and ran off, Ruby looked at Louis with laughter in her eyes. I guess we see where the idea of a Numa ranks when compared with cookies. Louis grinned, taking her hand and pulling it through his arm. Let's go. He cared nothing about his boys' cookie habits in comparison to being alone with Ruby. He helped her into the buggy, and once he was in beside her, he carefully tucked a lap robe over both of them, forcing them to sit close together on the seat. Ruby was surprised at how quickly her heart was beating as he picked up the reins and drove away from town. We're not going to drive into town, she asked. She'd expected him to head into town, to the new ice cream parlor there. It was where most of the courting couples in the area went when they were out together. I didn't want to take you into town where we'd be surrounded by people. I want a chance to get to know you better. He glanced at her, trying to gauge her reaction. Does that bother you? She shook her head. No. I'm just not used to being without a chaperone. David and I were followed everywhere we went. They'd been sweethearts from the time they were 15 until she moved when they were 17. Louis nodded. He'd wondered if she was still a virgin, and he was pleased to hear she was. Women should only give themselves to their husbands. So, how did Mrs. Sanders end up with 15 girls, he asked. The woman was odd, but kind, and he had wondered for a while where she'd collected the girls from. It was odd that someone of her age would even want that number of girls around. Ruby briefly explained about the orphanage where she'd grown up and how it had been turned into a boys' home. I lived in Orlan my entire life until we were told we had to leave. I'm glad Mrs. Hayes came with us, but she fell in love with the driver of the bus that brought us here. She was fond of Mr. Hayes, because he had fought for them to stay at the orphanage without even knowing any of them. I think I've met her and her husband, Tino. I'm sure you have. They come into the store pretty often. Anyway, when we got here, there was no house waiting as we'd been promised. It was a lie. We had nowhere to go. When Edna Petunia saw us, she immediately started asking if we were bastards, because she always had a fondness for bastard children. Louis laughed. I can just picture her saying that. She had just married Cletus a couple of months before, so she said she'd adopt us. All 15 of us. The house is certainly bigger than the one where we lived in New York, with twice the number of children. Ruby thought back to the day when they'd been uncertain if they'd even have a home. It was frightening for all of them, but Edna Petunia had taken them all in, making it better. Are you happy there? I am. My sister and I are still together. I was upset at first, because David is so far away. She sighed. If he couldn't stay true to me now, he wouldn't have stayed true in marriage, though. She knew she was better off to learn that he didn't want her now, but it didn't feel that way at the moment. You're probably right about that. He pulled the buggy off to the side of the road, slipping an arm around her shoulders. Ruby looked at him with surprise. What did he think he was doing? Why are we stopping? Louis looked at her, her face illuminated by the moonlight. I want to know if we're compatible, he said, cupping her face in his hands. Won't we learn that as we drive and talk? I know we're compatible in a strictly intellectual sense. I like you as a person, and I think you like me. No, what I want to know is if we're compatible sexually. She pulled away from him. I'm not having relations with you. Louis smiled, one of his hands sliding to the back of her neck while the other went to her waist, pulling her back toward him. I'm not asking you to. I just want to kiss you to see if we'll both enjoy it as much as I think we will. His eyes were on her lips. She stared at him for a moment. She and David had kissed a few times, but not often. Slowly, she nodded. I will allow that. He grinned. She was so formal about so many things. He liked it. He lowered his head and softly brushed his lips across hers, his thumb going to her cheek to caress it as he kissed her. He lifted his head. Open for me. How could he tell if they were compatible if she kept her lips locked together? She frowned in confusion. What do you mean? Your mouth, sweetheart. Open your mouth for me. He lowered his mouth to kiss her again, his tongue licking along her tightly closed lips. He raised his head, looking at her. Why do you want me to open my mouth? David had never asked her to do that. So I can kiss you properly. Didn't David ever kiss you with his mouth open? She shook her head, intrigued by the idea. No. Never. He lowered his head again, his lips brushing hers until he felt her mouth open slightly. He licked the inside of her top lip, and she shuddered in his arms. She was surprised that it felt so good. She wrapped her arms around his neck, moving even closer to him, her body pressed to his. She was certain what they were doing was improper, but she liked it. A minute later, he raised his head, moving uncomfortably on the seat. We're compatible, he announced, his voice soft but confident. Ruby's heart was racing, and she felt a fluttering in her belly she'd never felt kissing her David. I think we are. I know we are. He kissed her again, quickly this time. Marry me. She stared at him. I thought we were going to get to know one another better. I know everything I need to know. I know you're a hard worker, and you'll be a good wife and mother. The only thing I was worried about was whether you'd take to making love well, and that was an important factor. That worry is gone. Her head was spinning. Surely he didn't expect her to respond immediately. The faster we marry, the more believable our story will be that you jilted David instead of the other way around. And the faster she'd be in his bed with him. That was the most important part, for him at least. Chapter 2. Ruby still hesitated. She could see the logic in marrying quickly, but she wasn't certain she could actually go through with it. How soon would you want to marry? Lewis wanted to tell her they'd go roust the preacher from his bed, but he had to be logical. Saturday morning. That's so soon. It was Wednesday. He only wanted to give her 3 days before they married? How about a month? How about Saturday? He felt like he was being generous giving her that much time, because he was set to get the preacher first thing in the morning. He'd happily take her off to bed, and let the preacher marry them the next day if she argued too much. She stared at him, thinking. She liked kissing him, but he'd want to do more than that. Mrs. Hayes had explained what boys would want from girls, and Ruby wasn't certain she was ready for that. If I marry you Saturday, can I have a week to get used to you before we dot you know? No. We marry Saturday morning, and Saturday night, we'll make love. I want you, Ruby. She bit her lip. He hadn't said he loved her, and she was certain he didn't. He just wanted her sexually, and while that made her feel like she was appealing, it also frightened her. He wasn't a young man she would learn with. He already had 2 children. I don't know. He leaned down and kissed her again, pulling her closer to him, his hands exploring her body. One hand slid over her back while the other moved from her neck down to her breast, cupping it in his hand. His thumb found her nipple through the layers of fabric, and it was already taut. Marry me, he insisted against her lips. Ruby arched into his hand, feeling wanton. She shouldn't allow him to touch her this way. He'd think her a loose woman, but she didn't know how to stop him. Yes, I'll marry you. He rested his forehead against hers. Saturday? He asked softly. She nodded. Saturday. She felt like she'd agreed to give her life away, but he was right. It was a way to avoid humiliation for her. But it was more than that. She wanted to marry him. She wanted to kiss him forever and never stop. She'd never wanted to kiss David that way. Surely that meant she was meant to be married to him. Lewis kissed her goodnight on the front porch of the house, taking a last moment alone before they were around people again. She clung to his shoulders, wishing she knew why her feelings for him were so strong. After he broke the kiss, he asked, "Should I ask Mr. Sanders for your hand in marriage?" She nodded. I think he'd like that a lot. Cletus enjoyed being a father figure for the girls, especially the younger ones. As one of the oldest, she wasn't as close to him, but she knew he would feel important if he were asked for her hand. She had no doubt that he'd grant it, though. They went into the house, listening to the sounds of the boys playing in the informal parlor at the front of the house. They're probably in the formal parlor, she said, leading him toward the back. I hope you realize my house isn't anywhere near this grand. He almost felt guilty for planning to take her away. Almost, but not quite. His house was very nice by local standards, and though it didn't display the wealth hers did, it was still a good home. She shrugged. I'm an orphan. I grew up with nothing. This past year, I've received my first new dress. I'd always worn hand-me-downs. I don't need grand. She led him into a room where Edna, Petunia and Cletus were sitting close together on the sofa, sharing Edna's flask of cough tonic. Cletus looked Louis up and down as if he were trying to decide if the younger man was good enough to be escorting one of his girls. Louis, he said with a nod. Louis suddenly felt tongue-tied. He'd asked for Carrie's hand in marriage, and he hadn't been half as nervous. Of course, his feelings for Carrie hadn't been nearly as strong either. He'd taken one look at Ruby and wanted her to be his. Carrie had been his sweetheart in school, but he hadn't felt nearly as much for her. Mr. Sanders, I'd like to ask for Ruby's hand in marriage, he blurted out. Cletus seemed to think about it for a moment, rubbing his chin as if he had a beard, but he was clean-shaven. It was an odd gesture. He looked at Ruby. You want to marry him? Ruby nodded. I do. She almost laughed at herself for her choice of words. It sounded like she was already making her vows. What about the man waiting in New York? That was the question Ruby had been dreading. We've called it off, she answered simply, hoping they'd leave it at that. Cletus and Edna Petunia both studied her, obviously wanting to know more than what she'd told them, but when she didn't volunteer the information, they seemed to let it go. Finally, Cletus nodded. Yeah, you can marry her, but you need to understand, if you ever hurt her, I'll hunt you down and there'll never be a trial, because they won't be able to find the body. Louis nodded. Yes, sir. I won't hurt her. Edna Petunia smiled. Now that's settled, when is the wedding? Saturday, Louis said, leaving no doubt that the date was non-negotiable. Saturday? Edna asked, leaning back and reaching for her flask, which was gripped tightly in Cletus's hand. She took a large gulp and shook her head. How can we get you ready to marry by Saturday? There's so much to do. Ruby shook her head. I've never dreamed of a big wedding, Edna Petunia. I always thought a quiet wedding at home would be nice. We could have everyone I love right here in this parlor. But what about the food? Ruby shrugged. Make something. We'll eat it. It doesn't really matter what, but I want my girls to have big, beautiful weddings. The kind this old coot didn't give me. Edna Petunia glared at Cletus. You should have given me a big wedding. I would have if you hadn't been so determined to keep your legs crossed. He looked at Louis and nodded. We'll make it happen on Saturday. Louis could tell he understood, even though thinking of the older couple having relations bothered him. Thank you, Mr. Sanders. I'm about to become your father-in-law, boy. You need to call me Cletus like everyone else does. Louis thought it was odd the girls called the old couple by their first names, but he said nothing about it. Obviously it was something that worked for the family. Yes, sir. He caught Ruby's hand. Let's tell the boys together. That made Ruby more nervous than telling Cletus and Edna Petunia. What if the boys didn't like her? All right. She led the way to the front parlor and stopped in the doorway, watching as her sister played with the two boys who were about to become her sons. Louis snapped his fingers and both boys jerked to attention. We want to tell you something. Robert looked at his father for a minute before his whole face lit up. You're getting married, and we're getting a new ma. He turned to Opal. And you'll be our Aunt Opal. I always wanted an aunt. Opal laughed, musing Robert's hair. I'll be the best aunt two boys ever did see. Louis smiled at the exchange. Would you be willing to keep them on Saturday night? We're getting married Saturday morning. Opal's eyes met Ruby's. She was obviously confused, and Ruby knew she'd be spilling out her heart to her sister before bed that night. Opal had a right to know everything. Opal nodded. Yes, of course, I'll watch them. They're sweethearts. Thank you, Ruby said to her sister, her eyes making it clear they'd talk about what had occurred that day. Louis leaned down and kissed Ruby softly, unlike the kiss he'd given her on the porch. He wanted the boys to get used to seeing him kiss Ruby. James made a face. Why you kissin' her? She's our new ma, not yours. Louis smiled. She's going to be my wife, and men get to kiss their wives. Why? Louis shrugged. You'll understand when you're older. Pretty girls are made for kissin'. Robert sighed. Just don't do it too much, I might have to vomit. Vomit? From watching me kiss your new ma? Are you crazy? Louis walked across the room and threw his son over his shoulder, filling the room with peals of laughter. No one is going to vomit as a result of kissing. He strode toward the front door, letting James run ahead and open it for them. He stopped once he was on the front porch. I'll see you in the morning, Ruby. He would lure her into the back room for another lesson in kissing. She was a wonderful student. Ruby shut the door behind them, sensing her sister standing behind her. I'll explain everything. They went into the parlor and Ruby explained about the letter and Louis's offer. I like him. Opal shook her head. Liking a man isn't enough reason to marry him. What are you thinking, Ruby? I'm thinking I don't want to spend the rest of my life alone. I'm thinking everyone in town has been waiting for me to go back home to marry David, and I don't want to be pitted. He needs a wife, and I like him. Ruby leaned closer to her sister. His kisses make my body sing in a way David's never did. Opal's eyes widened with surprise. Has he done well, have you? Ruby shook her head. No, not until our wedding night, but we've kissed. A lot. It's very nice. I wish you the best. Opal still seemed worried for her, but Ruby knew she'd be there for her every step of the way. Thank you. You'll stand up with me, won't you? Opal nodded, smiling. I have to. We're twins. Ruby leaned forward, hugging her sister tightly. Thank you. She sighed. Will you go with me after work tomorrow, to tell Mrs. Hayes what I decided? She wasn't looking forward to telling the woman who'd raised her she was rushing into marriage. Does she know about David? Ruby nodded. Yes, but she and Louis are the only ones other than you. I wasn't going to tell you, but I can't hide something like that from my twin. Opal smiled. I'd like to see you try. Ruby was at work a few minutes early the following morning, rushing out early to avoid Edna Petunia's endless wedding talk. She had no desire to plan a big wedding, and Edna was already planning some fancy dishes to make. Louis unlocked the door to let her in, but instead of letting her go to her corner of the store to her sewing machine, he pulled her into the back room. As soon as they were out of sight of prying eyes, Louis pulled her into his arms and kissed her passionately. His hands went to her back and he molded her against him, pulling her as close as he dared. Ruby wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back, not at all worried about being wanton any longer. Obviously that's how Louis liked her. "Good morning, wife," he whispered against her lips. She smiled. "I'm not your wife yet." "You will be, and I can't wait." He groaned, looking at his pocket watch. "We have 10 minutes before the store opens. How would you feel if I showed you around upstairs, so you can get an idea of where you'll be living?" She nodded. No kissing up there, though. She knew it was strange for her to make that rule, but she was starting to become afraid they wouldn't be able to wait even 2 days before they consummated their relationship. He nodded. "We don't have time for any canoodling. Just a quick tour." He took her hand and led her out of the storeroom and up the narrow staircase, behind the store. "That's the parlor." He waved his hand toward the kitchen and dining room. "Food happens in there." He kept tugging her along. "We have 3 bedrooms. Each of the boys has his own." He pointed out their rooms as they passed. Finally, he came to the room at the end of the hall. "This is our room." She peeked into the room and saw the big bed. Well, big compared to the small bed she had at home, but really small if you thought about two people sleeping in it side by side. It's nice, she said, at a loss for what he wanted her to say. He opened one more door. Water closet and bathtub. Oh, good, I'm glad the house is so modern. She had used an outhouse growing up, and she was thrilled to see that she wouldn't need to do that there. The Sanders house had a bathroom, and she had grown used to it. He smiled. I had that added just after I moved in. And do you want to know a secret about it? She looked at him curiously. I had you in mind when I did it. I was hoping you'd marry me, and I knew you'd want the comfort. She blushed, not sure how to respond to that. She'd been engaged to someone else, and he'd been installing bathrooms for her. He didn't worry about not getting what he wanted in life. Edna Petunia was one of the first customers of the day, wandering back to the corner where Ruby was working with a notepad and pencil in her hand. I'm thinking about food for the reception. Ruby shook her head. Edna Petunia, I want a small wedding. Just family, and no reception. Why do you think we need to have a reception? She was starting to worry the older woman would ignore her feelings and go ahead with her own plans. We'll call it a wedding lunch then. Would that make you happier? If we end up with a house full of people at my wedding, I'm really not going to be happy about it. I just want a quiet wedding with me, Louis, the boys, and all the girls. And Mrs. Hayes, of course. Ruby thought for a moment about whether or not there was anyone else she wanted there, remembering when Tino had helped search for her when she'd run away on the trip to Texas. Don't forget Mr. Hayes. But what about Iris and her family? No one has a wedding without the town doctor in attendance. Ruby rolled her eyes. You can ask Dr. Iris, but no one else. I really don't want to be surrounded with people. Please. Edna frowned, but nodded. I'll limit the people. She looked down at her list. Now, what do we want to eat for your wedding lunch? Sandwiches and cake? She didn't feel like there should be a huge celebration of the wedding, because she and Louis weren't marrying for love. Edna Petunia shook her head emphatically. No. It needs to be something nice. I want you to remember the day with fondness. How about roast beef with mashed potatoes and gravy? I'll make a big cake as well. That's a lot of work for you. There are 15 of us. You don't want to set that kind of precedent, do you? Yes, I do. Every one of you girls will get whatever wedding you really want. It's my job to make it just as nice as I can. Ruby finally nodded, giving in. Roast beef would be fine. Thank you for wanting to make the day special for me. Edna's face lit up. I know you were already 17 when you came to us, but I love you every bit as much as if you'd been left on my doorstep when you were a tiny little bastard baby. Ruby sighed. My parents were married. That's okay. You'll always be a bastard to me. Thanks, I think. Edna hurried away to get the things she needed for the wedding lunch. Ruby watched her go fondly, knowing there would be a great deal more food than the wedding guests could eat. She couldn't help but love the crazy old woman. Louis and the boys walked her home after work that evening, her hand held firmly in his. Are you going to keep working after we're married? He asked. Do you want me to? He shrugged. I don't want you to work the hours you're working now. If you wanted to continue to sew a little, that would be fine, but we really don't need the income. If it made her feel better to work, though, he wouldn't complain much. Why don't I help out as needed then, but I won't worry about making money from it. He squeezed her hand. That sounds perfect. I'm looking forward to having some real meals for a change. She laughed. You don't even know if I can cook. What if I burn everything? You'll figure it out. I've watched you, and you're a smart, determined young woman. I have no doubt you'll be a great cook within a year if you're not already. He looked at her. Can you cook? She shrugged. Passably. I'm certainly no Sarah Jane, but I can make something edible without a great deal of effort. Sarah Jane is one of your sisters, right? Ruby frowned. I guess technically she is, because Edna Petunia and Cletus adopted us both, but we're not related by blood. Opal is the only one related by blood. He nodded, understanding well that her situation was complex. When they reached her house, the whole place was in an uproar. Katie and Hattie were out front pulling weeds from the flower bed that hadn't yet been planted. Dorothy was washing the outside of the windows. "What are you doing?" Ruby asked. It was far too early for spring cleaning. It was only February. Edna Petunia said the house had to be spotless before Saturday and started assigning chores. Mrs. Hayes is talking to her in the formal parlor. Ruby sighed. "I'd better go join them." "I'll see you tomorrow," she said, turning to Louis and raising her lips for his goodbye kiss. She was surprised how natural it seemed to kiss him now. Louis kept the kiss brief, wishing they could have more time together, but smiling as he thought of Saturday. He'd have all night with her. Chapter 3. Ruby hurried into the house, skirting around her sister friends, until she got into the parlor where Edna Petunia and Mrs. Hayes were talking. Mrs. Hayes slowly got to her feet, scooting to the edge of the sofa and getting up belly first. She was due in less than a month, and her movements showed it. "Ruby, are you sure you're making the right decision?" Ruby shrugged. "Sit down, Mrs. Hayes." She sat beside her. "I don't know if I'm making the right decision at all. I have feelings for Louis, but they're different than what I felt for David. I like his boys. I feel like it's the right thing to do at this moment. Hopefully I won't regret it in a year." Mrs. Hayes looked over at Edna. "Would it be all right if I spoke alone with Ruby for a moment?" Edna got to her feet. "I think that's a fine idea. I'll bring tea and cookies." As soon as the door was closed behind her, Mrs. Hayes turned to Ruby. "What do you mean your feelings for Louis are different?" Ruby blushed, not sure how much she should say. Mrs. Hayes smiled. "You know you can tell me anything, Ruby. I'm the one who caught you kissing David when you were 15 and spanked your bottom when you were 5 and you stole candy from the mercantile." Ruby smiled. "Yes, ma'am." She struggled to come up with the right words to say. "I felt so much for David. It was like my heart was breaking in two when we left him, but when he kissed me, it was nice, but I didn't feel anything special. When Louis kisses me, it's like my whole body is on fire. I feel a tingling feeling deep inside me. I don't love him. I barely know him. But I feel so much more than I ever felt with David." That's what I wanted to hear. "It sounds like you're a good match physically. Love will come, but you need that initial attraction. He seems like a good man." "I really think he is." Ruby shrugged. "You and Mr. Hayes will be here for the wedding?" "I wouldn't miss it." Mrs. Hayes seemed to hesitate for a moment. "Would you like to wear my wedding dress? It's nothing fancy, but I'd be honored if you wore it when you married Louis." Ruby nodded. "I'd like that a lot, if you don't mind. I was just going to wear my Sunday best. We're very close to the same size. I'll send Tino over with it this evening. I'm sure Penelope could do better for you, but there's just no time." "That sounds wonderful. Thank you for thinking of me. I'll take good care of it. You never know, you may have a little girl who will want to wear it someday." Mrs. Hayes put her hand on her belly. "Tino is determined this first child be a boy." "Do you want a lot of children?" Ruby asked, wondering what it would be like to carry a child within her body. "I'd like a few. I'm too old for many." "Does it hurt? The baby being inside you?" "It's more discomfort than real pain. The real pain will come when I give birth." Mrs. Hayes sighed. "I'm ready for him to be born, no matter how much pain is involved though. I feel like I've been carrying him for 20 years. "At least we have a good doctor in town," Ruby said, thinking about Iris Harvey. Edna Petunia thought a lot of the doctor, and so did Opal, who worked for her family. "Yes. I'm thankful for her. And she's due a few months after me, so I don't need to worry about her missing my delivery. It must be strange being pregnant at the same time as your doctor." "It is, but at least we have a lot to talk about." Edna Petunia interrupted then, bringing in a tray with a teapot and a plate of cookies, along with some cups. I feel like I should be helping with the cleaning, Ruby announced to no one in particular. Edna Petunia shook her head. No. This is their gift to you. Sarah Jane is helping with the cooking, of course. Of course. Sarah Jane had been the first to become close to Edna Petunia. She loved to cook, and it had been a delight for her to cook with the older woman. You're keeping it simple like you promised, aren't you, Edna Petunia? Edna frowned. I'm trying my very best. I want you to have a big beautiful wedding, but I'll do what you want, no matter how much I hate it. I'm sure the other girls will want that. I just want simple. I'm beginning to understand how Mary Sullivan felt, Edna mumbled under her breath. Excuse me? Ruby asked. Nothing that matters. Edna jumped to her feet. I'm going to go work on baking some cookies for the wedding guests. We're going to have a beautiful wedding if it kills me. Ruby shook her head as the old woman rushed from the room. Ruby got more and more nervous as the day progressed on Friday. She'd only planned to work half a day so she could get the dress fitted to her by Penelope and do her best to rein Edna Petunia in with the wedding preparations. She went behind the counter to kiss Louis goodbye before leaving work. I'll see you in the morning. I'll be there. The boys are going to stay at your house with Opal, right? Ruby nodded, suddenly feeling shy. Yes, she's planning for that. The boys are really excited. They love your sister, Ruby smiled. She loves them as well. They're good boys. Usually. What happens if they aren't good? Ruby shrugged. I guess we'll deal with that when the time comes. If you're worried their behavior will scare me, don't. I was raised in a house with almost 30 other orphans. Someone was always getting into some mischief or other. Mrs. Hayes was a good role model. If she could be half the mother Mrs. Hayes was, she would be thrilled. Louis looked around the store, and seeing he had no customers, he leaned down and kissed her like he wanted to, pulling her body to his and ravishing her mouth. I can't wait till tomorrow when I won't have to stop at a kiss. Ruby blushed. I should go. He laughed softly. You're going to like making love, Ruby. I promise. She hurried from the store, not looking back. She was halfway home before she realized that she'd forgotten to mention Penny to him. The other girl was only 16, but she wanted to work after school, doing Ruby's job, so she could make some extra money. Ruby suspected she may have a sweetheart at school, but she had no proof of it. When she got home, Edna Petunia was in the kitchen, baking cakes. The whole house smelled wonderful, and it was all Ruby could do to stifle her sweet tooth, and not beg for some of the cake right then. Where's Cletus? She asked. Edna Petunia sighed. He's gotten it into his head that he needs to be the sheriff around here. He's too old, and I don't know what he's thinking, but that's what he says he's going to do. Why? I think it's because of you girls. He's afraid that something will happen to one of you, and he'll have to go kill whoever hurts you. Says it'll be easier to explain away if he's the sheriff. Ruby shook her head. Sounds like he has it all figured out. Oh, the old coot hasn't figured anything out. He just thinks he has. Edna Petunia waved Ruby to the table. I made lunch for us. Are you hungry? Ruby shrugged, eyeing the sandwiches Edna put on the table. The old woman was usually home alone all day, and Ruby could tell she was pleased to have some company for a change. What kind of sandwiches are they? Chicken salad. They're one of my favorites, but I don't usually take the time to fix them if it's just me. You know you could fix them for supper. None of us girls are used to the fancy cooking you do every night. Edna shrugged. I know that. I feel like you've all been deprived for years, so you need someone to take good care of you. Ruby sighed. I know we grew up in an orphanage, but none of us ever felt like we were missing out on anything. Mrs. Hayes made us all feel loved. The only time we felt deprived at all was when we were kicked out of the orphanage. I'm still going to do everything I can for you girls. I want you to have the best lives you possibly can. Bastard children deserve love. Ruby shook her head at Edna. You know most of us aren't really bastards, right? My love for you is just as strong. There was much laughter and frivolity that evening as all the girls gathered around while Penny worked on taking in Mrs. Hayes's dress for Ruby. Opal was going to stand up with her sister and was wearing her new Sunday dress that she'd just finished making. She modeled it for the other girls while they sat in the informal parlor, laughing. "I can't believe Ruby's marrying someone other than David. It's like the world is coming to an end." Hope shook her head as if she were trying to understand what was going on around her. "I've realized that falling in love when you're a schoolgirl is a lot different than falling in love when you're a woman." Ruby deliberately kept her statement vague. She didn't even want the girls or Edna Petunia to realize that she wasn't in love with Louis. "Is he coming by tonight?" Opal asked. She was the only one who knew the full truth about Ruby's marriage with Louis other than Mrs. Hayes. Ruby shook her head. "We didn't plan for it. I think the boys wanted their father to themselves for one more night before I invaded their lives." She was only half joking. She had no idea what to expect from the boys. "They're fortunate to be getting a good Christian mother," Sarah Jane told them. Sarah Jane had always gotten on Ruby's nerves a bit. Her religious fervor after living with a pastor and his wife for a few years overshadowed a lot of her good points. "I hope so," Ruby said simply. "I've never been a mother, but I'll do my best by them." The girls stayed up past 10, reminiscing about their shared childhood. "I'm really going to miss you, Ruby," Katie told her. Katie was the youngest of the group. "I'm going to miss you, too, Katie." Ruby smiled at the sweet girl. "That reminds me, Katie. Would you sing at the wedding tomorrow?" Katie's face lit up, obviously pleased to be asked. "I'd love to. What do you want me to sing?" "I have no idea. You choose." Katie thought for a moment. "How about I Love You Truly? I know you like it, and it's perfect for a wedding." Ruby nodded with a smile. "I'd like that." Edna Petunia looked at the clock. "Do you realize it's after 10? We have a wedding in 12 hours. To bed, girls." Ruby got to her feet. Tomorrow was going to be a big day for her, and she knew she needed her rest. She hated to go to bed, though, because it would be the last night she would be able to do this with the girls. Chapter 4. Ruby woke earlier than usual on Saturday, the morning of her wedding. She'd had a dream that David was standing watching her as she walked down the aisle toward Louis. He had a sad look on his face, and she couldn't figure out why. It was an odd dream that she wanted out of her mind. It was her wedding day, and the last person she should be thinking about was David. She sat while her sister friends crowded around her, some fixing her hair, some just sitting quietly talking. "I'm going to miss this," Ruby said to no one in particular. Sarah Jane was helping Edna with the wedding lunch, while the rest of them lounged in Ruby's room. They all knew they'd have to go downstairs and help set up for the wedding any minute, so they were taking as much time as they could to spend with Ruby before she left. Opal reached out and took her sister's hand in hers. "We'll still be close by." "I know," Ruby said. "But it won't be the same. I'm thankful you're not moving back to New York. I don't know what I would have done if we'd been so many miles apart, written lots of letters, made ridiculously expensive phone calls, and visited every time the chance arose. Ruby would never have done well living so far from her twin, and she knew it now, even if she hadn't before." Opal smiled, wiping a tear from her eye. Edna Petunia stood in the doorway watching all the girls. "I need everyone but Opal, Ruby, and Penny downstairs to help get the chair set up." She waited till the others were gone before looking at Ruby. "Do you and I need to discuss what will happen tonight? Or did Mrs. Hayes talk to you?" Ruby blushed. Only Edna would bring that subject up in front of others. "I already know." "Thank you, though." "Well, I'm glad of that. I don't want to have to explain about playing hide the pickle with your husband in front of these girls." Edna Petunia turned and left the room amidst the giggles of the girls. "I swear that woman has no sense of decorum," Ruby said after a minute of listening to the others laugh. Opal grinned at her sister. "Life with Edna Petunia is never boring, though." A few minutes later, they had finished with her hair and were slipping her dress over her head. Ruby looked into the mirror and was surprised at what she saw. Somehow the girls had been able to make her pretty. Her dark hair hung in waves over her shoulders. Louis would be pleased. Of that she had no doubt. Opal took her seat in the hard-backed chair and Penny immediately went to work on her hair. As the only person standing up with Ruby, she knew all eyes would be on her. Opal was as blonde as Ruby was dark, and they'd always made a striking duo. As Ruby watched her sister transform into the beauty she tended to hide, she found herself wondering when her sister would marry, and who she'd end up with. She hoped she'd find a good man soon. Getting the boys ready for the wedding had Louis ready to pull his hair out. They didn't want to wear their church clothes, because church clothes were itchy. They didn't want to have their hair combed or take baths. By the time they were in the buggy on the way to the Sanders house, he was ready to leave them both for a day or 6. I need you boys to be on your best behavior during the wedding. Robert sat up straighter. I'll make sure James is good. James frowned. And I'll make sure Robert is good. Even if I have to sit on his head and toot. No one is sitting on anyone else's head. Louis sighed, ignoring the part about tooting. He was raising a couple of hooligans. Robert pushed James, knocking him into Louis. You can't make sure I'm good. I'm older than you. So? I know what good is. James pushed his brother back. No fighting. I don't want you fighting during the wedding or while Opal is taking care of you. Be on your best behavior for your new aunt. Robert leaned back against the seat and folded his arms over his chest. Stop worrying. You be on your best behavior with our new ma. Stop kissing her all the time. It's disgusting, and she doesn't like it. Louis raised an eyebrow. How do you know she doesn't like it? 'Cause she's a girl, and girls don't like disgusting things. She likes it when I kiss her. Robert shook his head. Okay, but if she runs off, you'll know why. Louis parked the buggy in front of the house, wishing he could have sent the boys off to boarding school back east, if only for one day. He knocked on the door, having it answered by one of the orphans he'd never met before. I'm Louis Darcy, he told her. I'm Alice. Come in. She held the door open, waiting for them to come in. The wedding will be in the formal parlor in the back of the house. I've been asked to watch your boys during the ceremony, because Opal will be otherwise occupied. Louis breathed a sigh of relief. If someone was watching over them, there was less chance they'd do anything crazy. Can I leave them with you now? Yes, of course. It's my way of helping. She took each of the boys by the hand. Would you like to have some cookies before the wedding? The boys half-dragged her into the kitchen. Louis walked to the back of the house, toward the formal parlor. Cletus was standing looking nervous as he tugged at his tie. Mr. Sanders, Louis said, holding his hand out for the older man to shake. Cletus nodded at him. Be good to my baby, he said. Louis thought it was odd that the man referred to a girl he hadn't met until she was 17 as his baby, but he said nothing. Obviously he took his job as adoptive father very seriously. I will do my very best. She's a special girl. Cletus nodded. That she is. Louis wasn't sure what else he was supposed to say, so he stood there awkwardly as people started to gather. When the pastor arrived, he excused himself to talk to him. He was an elderly gentleman with white hair and blue eyes. Thank you for agreeing to come on such short notice. I'm happy to be here. Sometimes the fast weddings seem to be the strongest couples. Ruby is a lovely girl. Louis smiled. She is. I hope she doesn't realize she's making a mistake before she comes down. As soon as the words were out of his mouth, he realized why he'd had such a hard time with the boys that morning. He'd been worried about her changing her mind at the last minute. After his wife left him, he'd lost his confidence where women were concerned. He was standing next to the preacher as people began filing into the room. Chairs had been set up so everyone would have a place to sit for the ceremony, and the girls were gathered around Cassie Hayes, who was heavily pregnant. Cletus was wringing his hands together nervously across the room. Louis walked over to him. Are you all right, Mr. Sanders? Just nervous. Never given a girl away at her wedding before. Louis smiled. He didn't know what Ruby's life had been like before she'd been adopted by the old man and his wife, but he knew it had been good since she'd arrived there. Edna Petunia rushed into the room, her bosom heaving. She looked frantic. Cletus, you need to get to the bottom of the stairs so you can walk Ruby in. What are you doing waiting in here? Cletus leaned down and kissed Edna square on the lips before he wandered out to get Ruby. Louis returned to his spot beside the pastor, looking out over the people there. It seemed as if Edna Petunia had done as she'd promised and kept the guest list to the bare minimum. Within moments, he saw Cletus and Ruby walking toward them. She looked more beautiful than ever, and his heart started to beat faster. She would be his bride in a matter of minutes. He couldn't wait. Ruby walked along slowly, holding Cletus's arm. He was so nervous, he was shaking visibly. "You're doing fine," she whispered to him as they walked. When they reached the preacher, and he asked, "Who gives this woman in marriage?" Cletus was befuddled. "Why, Edna Petunia does. Or I do. I guess we both do." Amidst the soft laughter, Louis took Ruby's hand, holding it tightly. She was there. If he gripped her tight enough, she wouldn't be able to run off. He was surprised when a young girl started singing a song he'd heard once or twice back east. Her voice was beautiful, and she smiled as she sang. He knew she was one of Ruby's fellow orphans, but he had no idea which one. He'd have to ask at another time. Ruby smiled at Katie as she sang for them. When she was finished, she waved at Ruby, her job done. She sat between Edna Petunia and Cletus, her hand clinging to the old woman's. And then the preacher was saying the words that would bind them together forever. Ruby repeated after him when he told her to, and listened as Louis said his own vows. At the end, when he was told to kiss the bride, a yell came from the assembled crowd. "Don't do it, Pa. Remember what I told you." Louis ignored Robert as he lowered his head, kissing Ruby softly. It was nothing more than a brief brush of their lips together, but already he felt his body reacting to her. In a few hours, they'd be alone, and when he kissed her then, he wouldn't have to stop. Ruby pressed her lips to Louis's ear. "Why weren't you supposed to kiss me?" Louis sighed. Something about kisses being disgusting and girls not liking disgusting things. He was afraid if I kissed you too much, you'd run off. Ruby laughed. "He doesn't have much faith in you, does he?" "None at all." He leaned down and kissed her once more, before everyone was upon them, hugging them and congratulating them. Edna Petunia was sobbing. "I can't believe you're already married. Why, it seems like we just got you, and already you're going off to start your own family." Ruby hugged the old woman reassuringly. "It was only a year ago. It went by very quickly. Too fast," Edna said, holding her tightly. "I'm going to make sure none of the other girls meet any boys ever." Ruby laughed. "Good luck with that." "Oh, I'm not senile. I know I can't keep them around forever, but I can want to. No one can stop that." "No, they can't." Ruby kissed her wrinkled cheek. "Thank you for being good to me. To all of us. I've always had a soft spot in my heart for bastards. I couldn't help it." "I know you have. That's what makes you so special." Ruby decided then that it was pointless to explain to the old woman over and over that they weren't all bastards. What was the point? She'd forget again in 10 minutes anyway. Chapter 5. Although the food at their wedding lunch was good, Louis had no desire to eat any of it. He just wanted to take Ruby and leave, heading back into town where his big comfortable bed waited for them. Ruby had never been comfortable around big crowds of people, and even though she knew and loved every person sitting at the table, she wanted to get away as quickly as she could. That obviously wasn't going to happen, though. Of course, she was nervous about being alone with her new husband as well. As if he read her thoughts, he reached over and squeezed her hand under the table. Leaning close, he whispered, "How soon can we get out of here? Are you in a hurry for something?" She wasn't certain what made her respond the way she did. Her grin told him that she knew exactly what he was in a hurry for. "Be careful. I'm not above throwing you over my shoulder and carrying you out of here. The look in his eyes told her he was serious about doing just that. Cletus would chase after you. He might anyway, she said with a frown. She could picture the old man chasing after their buggy, yelling something inappropriate at them. He leaned down and kissed her softly, not caring they were surrounded by people. Pa. Stop doing that. Robert's voice filled the dining room, and everyone at the table laughed. Ruby grinned at Robert. It's okay. I kind of like it. She winked at the boy. Robert's eyes grew wide. But you're a girl. She sincerely hoped her new husband wasn't given to kissing boys. Yes, I am. Louis looked at Robert. See, I told you she doesn't mind my kisses. Robert just shook his head before applying himself to his lunch. After the meal was over, Edna Petunia and Sarah Jane brought out the cake. It was huge and looked beautiful. Do we get to leave after we cut the cake? Louis asked, his lips against her ear, so no one else could hear them. Ruby laughed as she walked to the table where the cake had been placed. She and Louis took the knife together, cutting through the top layer easily. Ruby rushed around the room, passing out plates of cake and forks to everyone. As soon as she finished, Louis made a quick announcement. Ruby and I appreciate all of you coming to help us celebrate. All of you mean a great deal to her. Ruby smiled up at him, thrilled he was making a pleasant speech to save her from having to do it. She was still nervous with so many people pressing in on them. We're going to leave now, though, because I only have 24 hours alone with my sweet bride before we have to fetch my boys. Ruby blushed at that, surprised he'd be so obvious about wanting to drag her off and be alone. Everyone would know what they were doing. Really, though, everyone would know anyway, so how much did it truly matter? Ruby hugged her sister, thanking her for watching the boys before Louis took her hand and dragged her out of the house, grabbing her carpet bag with clothes for the weekend on the way out. She'd pick up the rest of her things when they came to fetch the boys. She glared at him once they were in the buggy. You should have thrown me over your shoulder. He laughed. No one thought anything of that. You're a beautiful woman, and we're married. They know I want to make love with you. But did you have to make it so obvious? I'm sorry if I upset you. I really didn't know how else we could get out of there. Ruby sighed, trying not to be angry with him. He was right that everyone already knew, but it was still embarrassing for her. The drive into town seemed to fly by, and when he pulled up in front of the store, he got down and helped her out. Go around back. I locked up the store, but not the house. Just go in. I'll unhitch the horses and be up in a minute. His lips went to her ear, even though there was no one else on the street. You might want to just go ahead and undress and wait for me in our room. But it's light out, that's not going to deter me one bit. He climbed back into the buggy and drove it off toward the town stables. Ruby hurried into the house and up the stairs. Did he really expect to make love to her during daylight hours? Every time she'd imagined what they'd do together, her mind had it in the darkness with all the lights out. She shut the door once she was inside his room, realizing only then that her nightgown was in the buggy with him. She frowned, wondering if she should stay dressed, or if she dared undress to her petticoat. She didn't want to disobey her husband right after they married, she'd do better saving that for next week. Keeping his wishes in mind, she quickly removed the dress, laying it lovingly over the trunk at the foot of his bed. She sat down on the edge of the bed and removed her shoes, setting them in the corner of the room, before unrolling her stockings. She quickly unlaced her corset and put it with the dress and stockings. She didn't dare undress any more than that. She moved toward the head of the bed to get under the covers, when the door opened behind her. Louis looked at his pretty bride, dressed only in her petticoat, with her hair spilling down around her shoulders. When he realized he still had her carpet bag filled with her clothes, he'd expected to find her waiting in her wedding dress, but no, she'd compromised. He dropped her bag on the floor, striding toward her. She watched him with her huge brown eyes, as if she was afraid of what he'd do. When he reached for her, she let out a soft sigh. He cupped her face in his hands, looking into her eyes, trying to gauge her emotions. Are you frightened? A little, she told him. I've never done this. I know you haven't. I'll be gentle with you. He frowned for a moment. Did Mrs. Sanders have a talk with you about what would happen? Ruby grinned. No, I already knew, and she was very relieved not to have to talk to me about playing hide the pickle with my husband. Louis blinked a couple of times before throwing back his head and laughing. She did not call it that. Oh, yes she did. I swear, the woman's crazy. She offered me a swig of her cough medicine. You know, the medicine in the flask she carries everywhere that Mrs. Hayes told us is really whiskey. What did you tell her? He asked, fascinated by the stories of the woman, and happy to distract her as he caught her waist and pulled her to him, holding her close. I refused, of course. I don't want to drink whiskey. She rested her cheek against his shoulder, happy to be in his arms. She wished they could stay just like that forever. The special tingling feeling was back in her stomach from being close to him, but he wasn't trying to get her to do anything she didn't want to do. It was the best of both worlds. Are you nervous? He asked, rephrasing his initial question. Very. I don't know what to do, but I don't want to make you unhappy. He smiled, leaning down and brushing a soft kiss across her lips. I know what to do. I had a feeling you did. Do you trust me? His hands went to the back of her one-piece petticoat that covered her from neck to ankles, searching for the button that kept it fastened. Mostly. She grinned up at him, surprised he was doing his best to put her at ease. That's what she needed from him more than anything. He chuckled. Well, I promise you, we'll get through this first time, and then all the other times will be easy. He kissed the spot just behind her ear. And fun. She tilted her head back to look at him, amazed at how tall he was. Fun? Women don't enjoy it. That wasn't something Mrs. Hayes had told her, but something she'd learned from school friends who had married. He shook his head. Who told you that rubbish? A couple of friends I had back in New York. They were married already when we left and said it hurt, and they didn't like it. He rubbed his hand over the back of his neck. It will hurt the first time, but I'll do everything I can to make it hurt as little as possible. You might even enjoy it this time, but if you don't, you'll enjoy it the next. She wasn't sure if she should believe him or not. He could just be saying that so she wouldn't be frightened. He'd asked her to trust him, though, so finally she nodded. All right. I believe you. He pushed her petticoat off her shoulders and to the floor, leaving her in nothing but her drawers. She automatically moved her hands up to cover her breasts. I want to see you, he said softly. Making love isn't about fumbling around in the dark. I want to see the woman I married. But a lifetime of modesty couldn't be forgotten simply because she'd agreed to love, honor, and obey. There's nothing wrong with me seeing my wife. His fingers trailed from her cheek down to her breast, cupping it in his palm. You're beautiful, Ruby. So soft and sweet. He lowered his head again, kissing her gently. He wanted to pick her up and drop her onto the bed, but he knew he'd have to go slowly. She deserved to be treated well. She had never let a boy touch her that way. Even David had never tried to touch her breast through her clothes, let alone under them. She was surprised by how good it felt. Louis felt overdressed. He wanted to feel her pressing up against his bare skin. He took an abrupt step backward and kicked off his boots before putting his hands to his tie. His eyes never left hers as he removed his tie and shrugged off his jacket before unbuttoning his shirt and dropping it to the floor. He stopped there, not wanting to frighten her, and took a step toward her again. Pulling her to him, he kissed her passionately, enjoying the feel of their bodies against one another just as much as he'd imagined he would. Ruby gasped as her breasts came into contact with the light covering of hair on his chest. It felt odd, but good. Don't you think we'd feel better lying down? He asked, hoping she wouldn't feel rushed, but knowing he couldn't stand there kissing her for the next 24 hours. Ruby swallowed hard, nodding. She backed up until she felt the bed against her thighs and sat down on the edge. Louis followed her onto the bed, pressing her onto her back and going onto one elbow beside her. Is there anything I've done so far that you haven't liked? He asked. She shook her head. No, I seem to like it all. As long as you're the one doing it all to me, that is. He moved his hand slowly from her neck down to her waist, still covered by her drawers. Moving further down, he found the slit in her underwear, and slid his hand inside, his fingers sliding between her slightly spread thighs and to her most secret place. She gasped as his fingers touched her where she'd never even dared to touch herself. She caught his wrist and tried to drag his hand away. You're not supposed to touch me there. I need to be sure you're ready for me. And you can tell by touching me there? He briefly explained how a woman's body made her ready for her husband's touch before he kissed her again, his hand still moving between her thighs. She closed her eyes, but let him play with her, enjoying his touch more than she would ever admit. Something was happening deep inside her, something she couldn't explain, but she enjoyed it a great deal. He abruptly moved from the bed, removing his socks and then his pants. He stood beside the bed and pulled her drawers down and off. She kept her eyes closed for fear of seeing him, knowing that would be inappropriate. Feeling the bed dip, she looked at his face as he moved between her spread thighs, taking his weight on one elbow. He reached down and guided himself to her opening, forcing himself to go slower than he wanted. Slowly he pressed inside her, watching her face for signs of pain. Ruby looked up at his face, trying not to tense up too much. She clung to his shoulders, wishing she knew what she was supposed to do. She lay back, feeling the pressure of him pushing into her. There was a flash of pain, and then she felt like she was full. It didn't really hurt, but it wasn't exactly comfortable, and it certainly wasn't pleasurable. Lewis held himself still, trying to give her time to adjust to his invasion. She didn't seem to be hurting, and while that pleased him, he knew she wasn't enjoying herself either. After a moment, she got fidgety, moving under him. He sucked in a breath, needing her to stay still if he had a prayer of not moving inside her. He wouldn't hurt her for anything, but he was afraid he wouldn't have a choice if she didn't quit wiggling. Just hold still for a bit, he told her through his gritted teeth. But, I want to move. Are we finished? She asked. When she moved, it had felt good. She wanted something. She didn't really know what it was, but she knew she needed to have it right away. Lewis kissed her softly. We haven't really even started yet. What are you waiting for then? She asked. He laughed. I didn't want to hurt you, but I guess you're ready for me to get on with it. She nodded. So ready. He began moving inside her, and soon she felt as if whatever was building inside her broke, and she groaned. Lewis kissed her again, rolling to her side. He gathered her to him, and cradled her head against his shoulder. I had a feeling it would be that good with you, he whispered. She sighed contentedly. That was nice. He just laughed. Yes, he'd found the bride he was looking for. She'd be wild in bed and a lady during the day, perfect for a wife and mother. Finally, things were looking up for him. Chapter 6. Lewis and Ruby went to get the boys after church on Sunday. They waited until they knew the family would be done eating before arriving to find an exhausted Opal and two very happy boys. Did they cause problems for you? Ruby asked while Lewis and the boys carried her things down the stairs and out to the buggy. Not really, Opal responded. They were just everywhere, and I swear there were 15 of them at times. They wanted to play outside in the rain last night, and it was too cold. They didn't want to have to wear their Sunday best 2 days in a row, because the clothes are too itchy. I'm just tired. Ruby smiled. Hopefully they'll be less of a handful in their own home. She had always been a bit of an optimist. I wouldn't count on it. How's married life? Are you happy? Ruby blushed. I am. Lewis is a good man. I made the right choice. I didn't marry for love, but I think love will come. I'm happy for you. I'm sad for me, because I've lost my sister and my roommate, but I'm happy for you. Ruby smiled. Won't it be nice to not have anyone to argue with me about what time the lamp should be turned down? Ruby liked to stay up late reading, while Opal preferred to go to bed early. They'd fought about it often. Opal shrugged. I'd rather fight with you than miss you. It's not like I'm going to be a long distance away. You can see me whenever you want. She certainly hoped her sister would visit often. They'd also see each other at church every week, which would help. It just won't be the same. No, it won't. But that's okay, isn't it? I suppose so. I'll miss you, though. Ruby hugged her sister tightly. Come visit me anytime. Don't give me a chance to miss you. Opal laughed. Absence makes the heart grow fonder. Someone should have told David that. Out of sight, out of mind. Louis came down with a small box of Ruby's belongings, and each boy carried a few dresses. Ruby had few possessions, because she'd saved every dime she'd made, knowing she and David would struggle when they married. Is this everything? Louis asked with a frown. Ruby nodded. Yes, it is. He looked at the meager dresses. You'll need to make yourself some more clothes. We can't have you running around in rags when you're the wife of the mercantile owner. She frowned at him. I don't wear rags. I've been saving my money for more important things. Dresses are the most important thing to spend your money on now. He turned and walked away at that, opening the front door to put her things in the buggy. Ruby looked at Opal. He's a good man, but I already want to strangle him at times. Wasn't her desire to murder her husband supposed to wait until they'd been married at least a month? It was odd that he could make her so angry, when David had inspired very few emotions in her. He'd been more of a comfortable shoe she was used to wearing. Louis pinched her toes. Opal tried to hide a smile, but she didn't fool Ruby for a moment. Isn't it a little soon for that? Apparently not. With one last hug, she hurried from the house to go out and join her new family. Louis gave her a hand up into the buggy, and she was pleased to see the boys were sitting quietly in the back. She turned to them. Did you enjoy your time with your aunt? Yes, ma'am, Robert said. I really like Aunt Opal. She's fun. But she wouldn't let us play in the rain. Of course she wouldn't. It was almost cold enough for that rain to turn to ice. If she had let you play in the rain, you'd both be sick as dogs today, and I'd have left you with her to take care of. You don't like sick kids? James asked, looking confused. I don't like when children are allowed to do something that will make them ill. Children have parents, or other adults watching over them for a reason. Robert sighed. So you won't let us play in the rain either? When it's hot outside, and you're not sick, you're welcome to play in the rain just as much as you want. When it's cold out, you'll be smart and stay inside. Ruby wanted the boys to like her, but Cassie had told her to start out strict. She could always get less strict, but if she started out too soft, she couldn't get stricter with any real results. Yes, ma'am. Robert looked at Louis. You could have found us a less strict new ma. Louis had to fight not to laugh over the disgruntled tone of Robert's voice. You wouldn't have wanted a stupid ma. That's what one who let you play in cold rain would have been, stupid. Sometimes stupid is fun, Robert mumbled. Ruby refused to answer that. They could think she was boring and strict all they wanted as long as they didn't play in the cold rain. Are you planning on going into the store to work tomorrow? Louis asked, feeling a change of subject was necessary. She nodded. I have 20 or so outstanding orders. I'll need to work every day, at least half days, until I'm caught up. She realized then that she hadn't yet talked to him about Penny working in the store. Oh, how would you feel about one of the other girls, Penny, coming into work after school? She is a much better seamstress than I am, and she'd like to earn some money. I don't mind that at all. Maybe she can finish the shirt orders so you can make yourself some more dresses. Oh, stop complaining about my dresses. You know as well as I do that orphans don't have the most elaborate wardrobes. She was already annoyed with him for calling her dresses rags. They were fine while she was working in his store, but now that they were married, he said she wore rags. If he was embarrassed of her clothes, then he shouldn't have married her. Well, you're not an orphan any longer, but instead, you're my wife. You'll dress better. She nodded. I'll make some dresses, but I need to finish the shirt orders first. Fine. but have Penny do as many of them as she will. I don't need you to make money. He hadn't realized until just then that he really didn't want his wife working. It felt wrong to him. Helping in the store was one thing, but making money on her own was something else entirely. I know that. I'm used to earning a wage, though, so it will seem strange to not work at all. I'll need help in the store occasionally, and there's plenty to do keeping house for our family. And cooking. The boys are sick of my cooking. We are. Robert agreed. Pa's the worst cook alive. Ruby sighed. She could see that her new family would be demanding. She'd be required to do what they wanted her to do. She'd somehow thought getting married would give her more freedom. She'd been wrong. Ruby decided to compromise with Louis, spending the mornings working on the shirt orders she had yet to finish, and the afternoons cooking, cleaning, and making a new dress. When the boys came in from school every afternoon, she had a snack waiting for them. She was surprised at how much she enjoyed taking care of her new family. Penny worked in the store in the afternoons, working on the shirt orders as well. Occasionally, she'd come to the house after she finished. Do you want to stay for supper? Ruby asked on Friday evening when Penny had stopped by to visit. Oh, I couldn't. Edna Petunia would worry. Ruby laughed. Edna Petunia always worries. She's probably still worried when I don't come home for dinner, and I don't even live there any longer. She asked me to stop in after I finished working tonight to make sure you were all right. She hasn't seen you since Sunday, so she's certain Louis has killed you and buried you somewhere in the woods outside town. Penny's voice was filled with humor as she told Ruby about the old woman's worries. Tell her I'm alive and doing well, and you know it was me, because I look nothing like my twin sister. Penny giggled. I'm going to tell her that. You know Edna Petunia, she'll love that. She crunched into an apple while she watched Ruby cook. She wants to know if she can have her sweet bastard grandbabies for a visit this weekend. Ruby sighed. They're not bastards. Why does she want everyone to be a bastard? The question was rhetorical. She was certain she knew why, even though the reason didn't make any kind of sense. I don't think there's a reason for anything she does, but that's okay, because she's lovable. She is lovable. Ruby thought about it for a moment. She knew Louis would like some time alone. How long does she want them for? She said if you were agreeable, I should take them home tonight, and you could pick them up from church on Sunday. She feels slighted because she has two beautiful grandsons, and she barely knows them. That's your fault, by the way. Oh, I'm sure it is. Let me go ask the boys if they'd like to go. Penny took a seat at the kitchen table. I'll wait here. Ruby went up the stairs. She could hear arguing coming from Robert's bedroom. I don't care what you say. Our new ma is lots prettier than our old ma, who doesn't love us anyway. Robert exclaimed. We're supposed to love our real ma best, no matter who's prettiest, James argued. Well, how can we love a ma who doesn't want us or care about us? I can't. Ruby knocked softly on the door, feeling like she was being a bad person by eavesdropping. Edna Petunia wants to have her new grandsons over for the weekend. You'd get to stay 2 nights. Do you want to go? She wasn't sure if letting them go was a good idea with the argument she'd just heard, but she knew she needed more time alone with Louis as they learned to adjust to married life. Robert jumped up excitedly. Yes, please. James nodded. I'd like to go. Edna Petunia is crazy. Ruby smiled at that. I don't know that spending the weekend with a crazy woman is what you should want to do, but I won't say anything. She packed a small carpet bag with their freshly laundered clothes. You're going to be good for Edna Petunia, right? Both boys nodded, James nodding so hard his hair flopped. Do you boys want to give her a special surprise that will make her very happy? Robert eyed her skeptically. He was not a trusting boy. What do we have to do? Call her grandma. The boys exchanged looks. Would she really like that? Robert asked. I can't think of anything she'd like more. Well, Edna would like it more if she found out the boys really were bastards, but Ruby kept that to herself. We'll do it. James told her. We want her to be happy. She's nice. She always lets us eat peppermint sticks that she keeps there. He pointed to Ruby's cleavage. Why does she keep peppermint sticks there? Ruby thought about how to answer that for a moment. You know, Edna Petunia is a mysterious lady. No one is quite sure why she does the things she does. We just smile at her and pretend it's all normal. Robert nodded. That sounds like a really good idea. We'll do that. Good. She'll be happy. We want her to be happy, James said. Chapter 7. By the time Louis came in from the store that evening, Ruby had dinner on the table. He frowned when he saw only 2 place settings. Did you already feed the boys? Ruby shook her head. Edna Petunia wanted them to spend the weekend with her, so I sent them home with Penny. I hope that's all right. Louis smiled. A weekend home alone with my new bride? I won't complain about that too much. He grabbed her to him, kissing her softly. I missed you while I was working. I was there half the day, you didn't have time to miss me. She laughed, her palms flat against his chest. You missed making love with me maybe. She pointed at the table. Dinner's ready. Wash your hands. Louis complied, and they had a quiet supper. It was nice for them both not to have to correct table manners or break up the boys' constant arguing. The boys are worried they're being disloyal to their mother by liking me, Ruby blurted out. She knew instinctively that it would need to be Louis who dealt with the problem, not her. What do you mean? Louis frowned. Roberta hadn't been in the boys' lives for nearly 2 years. They never spoke of her, and he'd hoped they'd forgotten about her. Ruby relayed the argument she'd heard earlier. I pretended I didn't hear them. That's probably for the best. I'll have a talk with them this weekend. Maybe I can take them fishing after church on Sunday. The boys liked to fish, and it seemed to be when they were willing to talk about anything and everything. Put fishing poles in their hands, and they'd spill secrets to anyone. That sounds like a good idea. I wouldn't mind talking to them about it, but I think it would be better coming from you. No, I'll handle it. He toyed with his food for a moment. Do you want to go for a drive after supper? Or we could go to the ice cream parlor? I'd rather just go for a drive if you don't mind. I've always liked being outdoors. While she did the supper dishes, he went down and hitched up the buggy. As soon as she was finished, she went outside, and he helped her up. He covered them both with a heavy quilt to ward off the cold night air as they drove out toward the Sanders house. Are you planning to stop? She asked, eyeing the house in the distance. No, this was just the way I drove. No desire to see the boys when we have a weekend away from them. He hadn't had a weekend away from his boys in the 2 years since Roberta had left. His arm was around her shoulders, and he drove with just his left hand. He drove them to the spot where they'd first kissed, stopping the wagon before tilting her face up to his. Do you have any idea how much I wanted to make love to you the night I brought you out here? Ruby laughed softly. I didn't then, but I have a better idea of how randy you are now. Randy, am I? He asked. I'll show you Randy. He grasped her waist, maneuvering her off the seat beside him and onto his lap, one knee on either side of his thighs. She squealed. No. This cannot end well. What was he thinking? Surely he didn't think they would make love right there in the woods for anyone to see. Oh, it'll end very well. He pulled her head down to his, kissing her passionately. Louis, no. This isn't a good idea. We need to go home if we want to make love. Why? There's no one here. Ruby couldn't let loose of her inhibitions enough to let him do anything more than kiss her on the open road. What if someone comes by? Please, Louis. Let's just go home. We have a nice bed waiting for us there. He sighed. How long is it going to take you to get over your inhibitions? She shook her head as she climbed off his lap and back onto the seat beside him, snuggling into his side. I don't think I'll ever be that uninhibited. I'm sorry. It's just not in me. That's too bad. Louis wasn't truly angry with her, but he was frustrated. He wanted her, and she was his wife. "I guess we're going home then." "Sounds lovely," she said, meaning it. She enjoyed making love every bit as much as he did. He pulled the horses back onto the quiet country road and drove them toward town a great deal faster than they'd left. Randy didn't even begin to describe him. Louis worked on inventory the next day while Ruby watched the counter and helped customers with their purchases. It was the first time she'd worked the cash register for more than an hour, so it was a strange experience for her. Penny sat in Ruby's usual corner, working the sewing machine and talking to the cowboys who wanted shirts made. When the stagecoach driver brought in the mail and dropped it in a big bag on the counter, Ruby immediately sorted through it, startled to find a letter from David in with the rest. She traced her name on the envelope before slipping it into her apron, unread. She had no time to mess with letters from old beaux while she was supposed to be working. She looked up to find Tino Hayes standing in front of her. "Any mail for us?" Ruby flipped through the letters. "Here's one from Fort Worth." She handed him the letter with a smile. "It's from my brother." He tapped it against his leg. "You doing all right, Ruby? Cassie's been worried about you." "I think being pregnant is making her worry about all her little chicks more than usual." She smiled. "I'm doing really well. Louis is a good husband. I'll tell Cassie that when I get home this evening. It'll make her happy." "I'd appreciate that, Mr. Hayes. Tell her I miss her." "How's she been feeling?" "Ornery," he said without missing a beat. "She's ready for that baby to come." "I'm sure she is. She must feel like she's got a kicking watermelon inside of her." Ruby had never really been around pregnant women, but she'd heard enough stories that she had an idea of what it would be like. He laughed. "I think that's a pretty apt description. We're both ready for that baby to make an appearance." "I'm happy for both of you," Ruby said softly, wondering idly when her turn to be a mother would be. She could be carrying right that moment. It was the first time she'd really thought about the consequences of her nights with Louis. She smiled, liking the idea of having a baby soon, one that looked just like his papa. She was startled to realize she had real feelings for Louis. She wasn't sure it was real love yet, but it was definitely growing. He was good to her. "Thank you. I'll give Cassie your best." "I appreciate that." She was still staring off into space, dreaming about a tiny little version of Louis when Penny waved her hand in front of her face. "We need to eat some lunch." "I'm starving." Ruby grinned at her friend. "You're always starving." "I know. Can we eat?" Edna Petunia packed some fried chicken, and it's all I'd been able to think about for hours. "Of course. I need to figure out what to make for Louis and me." Ruby thought about what she had on hand that would be quick to fix. It would probably have to be a sandwich so they could both get back to work quickly. "Oh, Edna Petunia packed lunch for all three of us. She said you were probably about to waste away to nothing since you were only eating your own cooking." Penny winked at Ruby. Ruby sighed. "I'm not a bad cook. I simply don't enjoy it like she and Sarah Jane do. Robert and James are thrilled with my cooking, compared to what Louis used to make. I'm sure you're an excellent cook when you're compared with Louis." Ruby refused to be baited. "Let me go get Louis so we can all eat together." She hurried to the back room. "Edna Petunia sent lunch with Penny for all three of us. Are you ready to take your lunch break?" He nodded. "Let's lock the door for 30 minutes and have a real lunch." "I need the break." Ruby rushed to the front door to do his bidding. Usually they took turns eating lunch, but it would be nice to have a break together. By the time she turned from locking the door, Penny had spread a quilt on the floor of the store, and she and Louis were sitting on it, digging through the picnic basket. "That smells delicious," Louis said. Ruby joined the others on the quilt, taking out the lemonade and glasses the old woman had kindly packed. "Make sure you tell Edna Petunia that I'm doing just fine without her shoving food in my face every 15 minutes. I won't see her until church tomorrow, and we don't need her to worry about me all that time." Penny laughed. "I'll tell her." They talked about how the boys were doing with their new grandmother while they ate. Edna Petunia has those boys spoiled rotten. She told me that bastards need extra spoiling. Louis grew rigid. My boys aren't bastards. Of course they're not, Penny returned. Edna Petunia thinks all children should be bastards. Why? He asked. Because she thinks bastards deserve extra love, and when it comes right down to it, she wants to shower all children with extra love. So she calls them all bastards, Ruby said. She'd finally put it together, and she was thrilled to understand the old woman for the first time. Why do bastards deserve extra love? Louis asked, truly confused. Ruby shrugged. I have no idea. That's a question only Edna Petunia can answer. She wants to think all of us are bastards too. I corrected her for the longest time, but then I finally realized that she wants us to be bastards. If it makes her happy, I'll be anything. She's been good to us. He shook his head. That's crazy. Penny laughed at that. No one ever claimed Edna Petunia was the least bit sane. She's lovable, though. She is that. As soon as lunch was over, Penny cleaned up their mess while Ruby unlocked the door, and Louis got back to work. It was nice to take a real lunch for a change, but it was just as nice to get back to work. There was a lot to be done. Ruby forgot all about the letter from David until she was baking the following afternoon. She put her hand into her apron pocket and pulled the letter out. She briefly considered throwing it away, but she felt like she should at least read what he had to say. She'd spent a lot of years thinking she was in love with him, after all. She knew now she'd had no idea what love was, but she'd believed it then. She slid the 2 loaves of bread into the oven before sitting at the kitchen table and opening the letter. Why would he have written her again? Wouldn't Maggie object to that? Dearest Ruby, the last letter I sent was premature. It only took me 3 days to realize I was making a big mistake. It's you I love, and I always have. Maggie is nothing in comparison to you, and I won't have anything else to do with her. Please say that you'll forgive me. I've saved enough money for your train ticket home, and will send it as soon as I hear you still want to come home to me. Please, Ruby, forgive me. All my love, David. Ruby stared at the letter in her hands for a moment, before sitting back in her chair, staring straight ahead. She couldn't go to him. She was married, and she had 2 boys. Even if she hadn't already married, though, knowing he was so fickle with his emotions wouldn't have allowed her to go back. What was he thinking? She allowed her mind to compare her feelings for the 2 men for a moment, something she hadn't really done before. As much as she had thought she loved David, she realized that it had been nothing but a schoolgirl crush. No, she was in love with her husband, someone who provided her with constant emotional and physical support. Someone who had rescued her from the embarrassment of being jilted, and was a good father and provider. Not to mention he made her blood sing. David was a boy, and Louis was a man. She didn't need to marry a boy and start a family with him. If things had turned out differently, and she'd never received the letter saying David was marrying Maggie, she would have married him without qualms. She knew now, though, that her life would have been much more difficult as David's wife. She belonged in Texas, where her sister, Mrs. Hayes, and Edna Petunia were available when she needed them for long talks. There was nothing left for her in New York except a boy who couldn't decide if he was in love with her or someone else. She got up and whipped up the batter for a cake. The boys would be hungry when they got home, and as their new mother, it was her job to see to it that they were fed. Chapter 8. Louis sat on the banks of the river with his boys, a picnic basket behind them, waiting for them to eat. Edna Petunia had insisted on feeding them lunch, so they'd taken the basket after giving Ruby her share. The woman was determined to fatten up the whole state of Texas, apparently. So what do you boys think about your new ma? Louis asked. Robert shrugged. She's pretty, and she's always nice to us, even when she's getting on to us. She's a good ma. James nodded. She is a good ma, but I don't think she's as pretty as our real ma. He sounded hesitant, like he was saying what he thought he should say and not what he was really thinking. Louis nodded at that. What do you remember about your real ma, James? The boy shrugged. Just that she tucked me in at night and kissed my forehead, and then one day she was gone. James had only been 5 when she left them, so his memories weren't nearly as clear as Robert's. What do you remember, Robert? Robert frowned, looking at the fishing pole in his hands. He was obviously trying to decide what the best way to answer the question was. I remember her yelling at me a lot. She did kiss us goodnight, but she threw things when you weren't home. One day she threw my cup at me. Louis closed his eyes. He'd known Roberta was volatile, but he hadn't realized she'd been violent with the boys. I never knew that. She told me if I told you, she'd spank me. She said that you didn't need to know how she disciplined me, because you were never home anyway. Louis sighed. That much was true. Until Roberta had left him, he'd been a traveling peddler, doing whatever he could to earn a living. He only went home once a month or so, long enough to check on his family to make sure they were all right. One day he'd gone home and found his wife had left the boys with his mother and filed for divorce. It had been a blow, but he'd always blamed himself for it, because he'd been gone. She'd said that was why she left. If I'd known she was threatening you, I'd never have left you alone with her. I hope you know that, Robert. Robert nodded. I do know that, Pa. You always made sure we knew you loved us. He smiled at Louis. I'm so glad we get to spend so much time together now. You never used to have time to take us fishing. We moved out here and bought the mercantile so we'd have more time together. Now that you have a ma, she's going to be able to help me run it as well. He looked at James, realizing he was the one struggling with Ruby. Robert had no problem with getting a new mother. You know it's okay to love them both, don't you, James? Both our new ma and our old ma? We don't have to pick? The boy looked intrigued by the idea. No, you don't have to pick. Not that it would matter, because Roberta's new husband had given him a lot of money to take the boys out of the state and never see them again. Buying the mercantile and moving to Texas had been the best thing to ever happen to him and his boys. Other than Ruby, of course. Ruby was everything he'd hoped she'd be, and more. She was good with the children, a wonderful housewife, and a warm loving wife in bed. He couldn't believe how lucky he'd gotten. Roberta had been a nightmare from day one, but he didn't believe in divorce. Well, he hadn't then at least. I can love them both? James asked, cutting into Louis's thoughts. Of course you can. Do you think I love you any less, because I have Robert too? If I have another child with Ruby, do you think it will make me love you less? James shook his head. No, I guess not. Louis watched as James grew silent, obviously thinking. Robert seemed content to never think about Roberta again, and he suddenly understood why. He had worried about James having too few memories of his mother, but apparently Robert had too many. Ruby had supper on the table for her men when they arrived home. The entire house smelled of the baking she'd spent her day working on. She served country fried steak for supper, something Cletus had taught her to make. He'd told her that the Texas cattle were so thin and tough they'd been hard to eat, so on the trail, they'd started pounding the steaks flat and frying them, turning them into one of the tastiest things Ruby had ever eaten. It definitely wasn't a New York meal, and she didn't know if Louis and the boys had ever eaten it, because they had lived in New Jersey until a few months before. Louis washed his hands, informing her that the fish had been too cold to bite, which sounded like a typical fisherman's excuse to Ruby. Why couldn't men just admit they hadn't been able to catch anything? When he walked to the table and sat down, he poked at the steak with his fork. What is this? One of the few Texas meals I know how to make. It's called country fried steak. Try it. It's delicious. Both boys watched as Louis took his first bite, obviously afraid to try something new, so they let their father go first. Louis chewed it slowly, smiling. The consistency is strange for steak, but it's really good. Robert quickly took a bite. I like this. James followed suit, declaring he'd eat it for every meal. How was fishing? Ruby asked, cutting into her own steak. It was good. We got some good man-talking done, didn't we, boys? Louis asked. Yes, sir, Robert replied. Fishing is the best time for man talk. James just nodded, applying himself to his meal, but Ruby was satisfied they'd talked. Ruby spent the following morning finishing up more shirt orders. She was pleased with how few she had left. Between the work she did in the mornings, and the work Penny did in the afternoons, they had accomplished a great deal in a short time. Ruby knew if she could keep working at the pace she had been, they would be caught up by the end of the week, and she would be free to make all the dresses her husband wanted her to make. Louis approached her at lunchtime. "Let's lock the door and take a real lunch like we did on Saturday." Ruby frowned. "I have a man coming this afternoon to pick up this shirt. I'll have to eat while I work. I packed you a lunch and put it behind the counter. That's not the kind of hunger I'm worried about." He took her hand and tried to tug her out of the store. "Let's go upstairs. I told you, I need to finish this. If it's not done by this afternoon, it will look bad for me." "What does it matter?" he asked calmly. "You're not going to keep the business going anyway." "It matters, because I gave my word." "Would you go back on your word?" Ruby knew his word meant a great deal to him. Surely he could understand her word meant a lot to her as well. "Well, no, but I have a family to support." "You don't." Ruby closed her eyes for a moment, annoyed that he would say such a thing. "That doesn't make my word mean any less." "I'm sorry, Louis, but you'll have to just make it through the day without a sex break." Louis turned his back on her and walked away. Why was she being so unreasonable? It wasn't like it would take hours to make love anyway. Ruby watched him go, irritated with him. Why couldn't he see that her word mattered to her? She'd been working for almost a year to build up her business, and she'd never been late with a customer's order. She wasn't about to start being late now. After Mr. Clemens stopped by the store to get his shirt, Ruby was too annoyed to be cooped up in the house. She needed to go for a walk to clear her mind. She had no idea why, but walking had always been her solution when she became angry. After a few minutes in nature, she rarely remembered what she was angry about to begin with. She grabbed her shawl and walked briskly out of town toward the Hayes ranch. Mrs. Hayes would always be the person she wanted to talk to when she was upset, and she wanted to take them a loaf of bread. She knew it was getting harder and harder for the older woman to do anything as her due date drew closer. Once she reached the ranch house, she knocked on the door to the small cabin, waiting for someone to welcome her. Instead of someone opening the door, she heard a crash from within. Ruby didn't hesitate to open the door. Mrs. Hayes was sitting on the floor, gripping her distended belly with both hands. "Are you all right?" "No. I was having pains this morning, but I didn't want to send Tino for the doctor yet, because I was told first babies come slowly. Well, this one seems to be coming awfully fast." Mrs. Hayes had a single tear dripping down her cheek. "I'll go get Mr. Hayes." Mrs. Hayes shook her head. "There's no time." Her eyes implored Ruby. "You're going to have to help me." "But, I don't know anything about it." "I do. I've delivered a few babies. I'll walk you through it. I just need you to help me." Ruby took a deep breath, hating the very idea of helping a woman give birth, but knowing she really had no choice. "Of course. What do I need to do?" Following the older woman's instructions exactly, Ruby rushed about nervously, wanting to be anywhere but there. Louis looked up as the boys walked into the store after school. "How was your day?" he asked. "Good," Robert said. Robert always said his day was good. Never any more or any less. "Where's Ma?" "She's upstairs, isn't she?" James shook his head. "No. We looked everywhere. She always has a snack waiting for us, and there was no snack." "We like the snacks she makes us," Robert added. Louis frowned, walking to where Penny was sitting in the corner of the store working as usual. "Did Ruby say she was going anywhere this afternoon?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual, as if he didn't suspect that his second wife had left him. What was wrong with him that he couldn't seem to keep a wife? "I didn't see her today at all." Penny barely looked up from her sewing. "She probably went out to talk to Edna Petunia or something." "Maybe. Listen, would you watch the store while I run over and see if she left me a note or something? Of course, watch the boys as well. Louis all but ran from the store, determined to find where his wife had gone. She wasn't the type to just run off, but he knew he'd made her angry that afternoon. Surely she wouldn't have used that as an excuse to leave him. He went into their bedroom, searching for any clues as to her whereabouts. All of her clothes were still there. He opened the small box she kept on the dresser that held her prized possessions and picked up a piece of paper on the top. He read over it quickly, his eyes closing. So that's where she'd gone. She was going to New York to be with David. But why had she left her clothes behind? And her money was sitting right there in the bottom of the box. She would have taken that, he knew. So where was she? Maybe she was letting Edna Petunia know she was headed back to New York. After living with the woman for a year, she owed her at least that. He went back down to the store. I'm going out to your house to see if I can find her. I'll close early. Do you want a ride home? Can you give me 5 minutes? She asked. Just meet me out front. I need to hitch up the buggy. He wasn't wasting any time. He needed to convince Ruby not to go. He hurried off, the boys following him to the stable. By the time he stopped in front of the store, Penny was waiting out front for him. He jumped down to help her up, before running back to the store to lock up. On the drive, he decided to quiz Penny in a low voice. Tell me about David. Penny frowned as she looked at him. David? Ruby's beau in New York? Yeah, unless there's another David I need to know about. She shrugged. I always thought he was really boring, but he was handsome. The only thing that made him interesting at all was that Ruby loved him so much, or at least, she thought she did. He was really easy for her to boss around. She'd tell him to do something, and he'd do it. I know Ruby doesn't seem bossy, but all of us listened to her. So you didn't think much of David? He was surprised. He'd gotten the impression that everyone was waiting for them to marry. I'm glad she married you, Penny said simply. David would have been a mistake for her. Does she feel that way? He asked. She married you, didn't she? When they pulled up in front of her house, Penny jumped down without help. Louis followed her to the door. Edna Petunia's probably in the kitchen. Do you want me to get her? Louis shook his head. I'll go talk to her there. When he stepped into the kitchen, he couldn't help but smile. 3 girls were helping with the supper preparations, while Edna Petunia directed each of them. Only one girl was off in the corner, throwing some things into a pot. He assumed she was Sarah Jane, the one Ruby talked about cooking. It only took him a few questions to realize Ruby hadn't been there that day at all. Was she upset at all when she left? Edna Petunia asked. Maybe a little, he said, thinking about their argument. He hoped she wouldn't ask why, because he didn't want to explain about their fight to her. Then she probably went to see Cassie Hayes. Cassie raised her, and Ruby thinks of her as a mother figure. Not me. Edna seemed a little sad when she said that. I'll go there and check on her then. Thank you. You're welcome. If she's not home, she probably didn't cook. You should all join us for supper when you find her. Louis couldn't help but smile. We'll do that. Chapter 9. By the time Louis found the cabin where the Hayes lived, he was almost in a panic. Had something happened to her? Had she taken just enough money for her train ticket and nothing else? Why would anyone do that? He stopped the buggy and told the boys to stay put as he set the brake and jumped down, hurrying to the house and banging on the door. It only took a moment for a frantic-looking Ruby to open the door to him. Her hands were covered in blood. Now I'm going to have to clean the door. Would you go find Tino? Please? Tell him he has a beautiful baby boy. Louis blinked a couple of times. Did you just deliver a baby? Ruby nodded, a tear streaming down her cheek, the only thing that gave away her level of anxiety. We didn't have time to go get Tino or send for the doctor. I had no choice. I was going to stay for 10 minutes, talk to her, and then come home. Louis decided it wasn't the time to ask about the letter. Do you know if they have another riding horse in the stable? I don't want to unhitch the horse. The boys will stay in the buggy while you clean up. He leaned down and gave her a quick kiss. I'm glad you're all right. I was worried. Ruby turned back to Cassie. Somehow, during the course of assisting the other woman with her delivery and listening to her yell at Tino throughout, she had lost the formality she'd always felt with the older woman. She'd cleaned the baby before she'd helped Cassie deliver the afterbirth, so now all she really needed to do was wash herself and hand the baby to Cassie. Once Tino is here, I'm going to send Louis and the boys for Dr. Harvey. She needs to make sure I didn't break you. Cassie chuckled. You didn't break me. Women's bodies were meant to give birth. She looked into the cradle that had been placed beside her. We need to name him. You don't have a name picked out yet? Cassie shrugged. Tino was convinced we would need to look at him to come up with an appropriate name, so he wasn't even willing to discuss it. Ruby finished washing her hands and walked back across the room to Cassie, scooping the baby in her arms and handing him to her. He's very wrinkled. Cassie laughed. New babies tend to come that way. We got a lot of them at the orphanage. Ruby pulled a chair from the table and watched as Cassie cradled the baby to her. I never knew that. I thought we mainly got toddlers and older kids. Cassie shook her head. The newborns were always dropped in the middle of the night, and we had a list of women who were barren we would contact. The babies were usually placed before you got up in the morning. I always felt that it was important for the newborn to get to know the arms of the mother who would raise him before any other. She trailed one finger across the baby's cheek, smiling when he puckered his lips. I had no idea. There was a lot going on in that orphanage you kept from us, wasn't there? Cassie nodded. There was. You were all children, and you didn't need to know how little regard parents had for their children. Ruby frowned for a moment, wondering if the time was appropriate to ask about her own parents. She knew nothing of where she and Opal had come from, and only had a few memories of a smiling blonde woman and a dark-haired man. You want to know about your parents, don't you? Ruby nodded. Do you know anything? Yes, quite a lot actually. Your father died in a factory accident in New York when you were 4. Your mother worked hard to try to provide for you and Opal, and she really struggled. She came and talked to me about leaving the two of you twice, but she couldn't bear to actually do it either time. She did? She did. She was very torn. She knew you'd get better care at the orphanage, but she was afraid there would be no love. Finally, she came to me a third time, right after the two of you turned 5. She told me she'd just married again, and she was going to go west with her new husband. She worried that the trip would be too hard on you girls, because they didn't have the money for a train. So, they were going to leave you until they were settled, and then her mother was going to bring you both out on the train as soon as they could send for you. Ruby's eyes widened. That sounds familiar. How many people in her life would make her wait for a train ticket? It should. Anyway, I later got word from your grandmother that their wagon didn't make it across one of the river crossings, and both your mother and stepfather went down with it. So, you became mine. Ruby frowned. She'd always known there were real people who were her parents, but to her, Cassie had always been her mother figure. Why didn't you tell us? You never asked. Either of you. At first, the two of you only spoke to one another. When you finally started talking to me and the other children there, you still wouldn't talk to the volunteers who came in every day to help. I got word over a year later of what happened, and you were both starting to do so well, that I couldn't bear to watch you grieve for a woman you had most likely already forgotten. Not totally, but no, you were probably right. I don't know if either of us could have handled finding that out then. We had each other, and more importantly for us, we had you. Thanks for being such a good mother to us, Cassie. Cassie smiled at her, tears coming to her eyes. I loved you too from the moment I saw you. You were always good and so helpful. It was a joy to be your mother. The door flew open behind Ruby, and she turned to see Tino run and looking frantic. Are you okay? He asked, sinking to his knees beside Cassie. Ruby took that as her cue to step outside for a moment. She wasn't going to leave just yet, because she needed to fix supper for the new family, but they did need a bit of time alone. Louis was waiting for her. "I'm glad you're here," she said, smiling softly. "Would you be willing to go get Dr. Harvey for us? You know where she lives, right?" Louis nodded. "I do." He pulled her close to him, stroking her back. "Are you all right? You looked so frightened when you opened that door." "Oh, I was. I'm all right, though. Cassie and the baby are both fine." She rested her head on his shoulder. "I was so afraid I'd lose one or both of them. I had no idea what I was doing." "You didn't, though. You did great." He kissed the top of her head. "I'm going to go get the doctor, and I'll meet you back here. Do you want to come with us?" She shook her head. "I'm going to fix supper for them. I'll be ready to go by the time you get back." The doctor lived on a ranch with her husband and daughters a few miles away. She'd have just enough time to fix something quick before they got there, and then she'd happily leave the doctor to take care of everything. She was not meant to be a midwife. Dr. Harvey rushed into the cabin where Ruby had just finished making a light meal for the family. Ruby wanted to burst into tears as soon as she saw her. "Please check them both and make sure I did nothing wrong that will hurt them." She was in a panic all of a sudden as she worried she'd hurt one or both of them. Dr. Harvey, 6 months pregnant herself, stopped in front of Ruby and hugged her. "I'm sure you did great. Women were made to give birth, and their bodies know what to do naturally, even though it's difficult for a woman to do on her own, she can. Please check them?" Dr. Harvey laughed, her beautiful face lighting up. "I will be happy to." She took the baby first, removing his diaper and checking him over. Instead of addressing Ruby, who was standing beside her, Dr. Harvey smiled at Cassie and Tino. "He's perfect." Cassie smiled. "I counted his fingers and toes, and he has 10 of each." Dr. Harvey laughed. "Most babies do." She then talked to Cassie, looking at the padding Ruby had provided for her. "You look like you were well taken care of. Has the baby nursed yet?" At those words, Ruby realized her job was done. She wanted to just go home and cry. She wasn't sad, but she was so relieved, she needed the release of tears. "Did Louis drive you, Dr. Harvey?" The doctor shook her head. "No. I brought my own buggy. Your husband can drive you home." She walked over to Ruby and looked her in the eye, making sure Ruby was finally paying attention to her. "You did a good job here. I know your first instinct would have been going for help, but from what Cassie just told me, there was no time. You did exactly what you should have done." Ruby nodded, thrilled to hear it. "Good night then. Cassie, I'm going to come by and check on you tomorrow. I'll make supper for you." Cassie smiled. "I would appreciate that. I'm sure I could handle it, but I'd rather give my time and attention to little Jonathan." Ruby smiled at the name. "I like the name. I'll see you tomorrow afternoon." She knew she could start dinner at home before she left, or even serve something cold. Her new family would understand. She hurried out into the frigid night air, rubbing her hands up and down her arms to try to ward off the cold. Louis helped her up into the buggy, and she sagged to one side, resting her head on his shoulder. "I'm ready to be home." Louis frowned. She sounded exhausted. "I promised Edna Petunia that we'd go by for supper." Ruby didn't want to see anyone else that evening, but she didn't know if she had the energy to cook either. "Okay." The drive to Edna Petunia's only took about 10 minutes. When they arrived, Louis helped her down, slipping an arm around her to help keep her propped up. Edna was waiting at the door, and she opened it wide. "You look terrible, Ruby. What have you been doing?" She led the way into the dining room. It was obvious everyone had already eaten, but Edna had set the table again, and while they sat, she hurried off to get the food. As soon as the food was on the table, and they'd served themselves, Edna Petunia sat down in a chair. "I asked what you did to get so tired." Ruby sighed, swallowing her bite of mashed potatoes. "I delivered Cassie's baby today. I went to her house, and she was in labor. She told me there was no time to go for Tino or the doctor, and she walked me through what to do. Edna Petunia grinned broadly. I'm glad you were there for her. Mother and baby doing fine? She pulled her flask from her pocket and swallowed a gulp. Ruby nodded. When Louis got there, he went for Tino and then Dr. Harvey. Dr. Harvey said I did fine. Iris wouldn't lie to you. Maybe you have a career in midwifery ahead of you. I'd rather sew shirts every day for the rest of my life, Ruby said honestly. Edna laughed. I'm sure it was rough on you. Boy or girl? Boy. They've decided to call him Jonathan. Oh, that's a nice name. He can be Johnny when he's small and then John or Jonathan when he's older. They chose well. Edna Petunia looked at Louis. You found her and brought her to dinner, just like you said you would. Thank you. You're not such a bad son-in-law after all. Opal walked into the dining room then, looking at her twin with surprise. You look terrible. Ruby looked down at herself. Being told how bad she looked twice in 10 minutes wasn't her favorite thing. When she saw the blood on her dress, she understood. She was suddenly thankful she hadn't had time to finish her new dress. I delivered Cassie's baby today. It was a boy, and his name is Jonathan. Mother and baby are fine. Opal put her hand over her mouth in surprise. Well, that explains the blood all over your dress and how tired you look. I'll tell the others. Ruby looked at Edna Petunia. Thanks for having supper ready for us. There's no way I would have had time to cook tonight. I always make enough to feed an army. You four are welcome for dinner every night. I don't know about every night, but I'm thankful it was an option tonight. She'd had a big day, both emotionally and physically. She'd have to find some time in the next day or two to tell Opal what she had learned from Cassie, but for the moment, she was too tired to even think about discussing anything with her sister. Chapter 10. When they got home, Louis put the boys to bed, and when he went into the bedroom he shared with Ruby, she was already sound asleep. She'd taken the time to take off her clothes, before she'd apparently fallen face down on the bed. He carefully moved her between the sheets and pulled the quilt over her. She'd had a rough day. The long talk he'd planned would have to wait. He slipped into the bed beside her, holding her close. She was too tired to make love, but that wouldn't stop him from holding her while she slept. He was thankful he'd been wrong about where she'd gone. He realized he wouldn't have let her go in a flash. No, with Roberta, it had been almost a relief when she'd left him. With Ruby? He'd hunt her down and drag her right back. He needed her with him. She'd be taking his heart right along with her. Ruby woke slowly the next morning, stifling a yawn. She needed to get breakfast on the table and the boys off to school, despite how tired she was. She got up, dressing in the early morning light. School started at 8:30 sharp, and it was already 7. She'd slept much later than she'd planned. As she was about to leave the room, she saw the letter from David laying on the dresser, unfolded. Had Louis read the letter? She thought about what was in that last letter from David and bit her lip. What must he have thought? She didn't put the letter back into the box, but left it where it lay, rushing down the stairs so she could get breakfast cooked. She and Louis had more time, because the store didn't open until 10, but the boys needed to eat soon. She made a simple breakfast while listening to the boys argue upstairs. Why the sound of it warmed her heart that morning was beyond her, but it did. She was thankful for her boys and her husband. Life had felt so fragile when she'd held that newborn baby in her arms. She swore to herself she'd never again take life and the people she loved for granted. The boys rushed into the kitchen, sitting down just as she was putting food on their plates and carrying it to the table. James eyed her. You didn't have snacks ready for us after school yesterday, and we couldn't find you. Oh, James. I was taking care of Mrs. Hayes. She's been like a mama to me since I was younger than you are, and her baby was born yesterday. I need to go out there again today, but if I can possibly make it back, I'll have your snack ready for you when you get home from school. Robert took a bite of his eggs, eating slowly. Pa thought you'd run away like our first ma did. Ruby closed her eyes for a moment. Did you boys think that too? Robert shrugged. I didn't. I told him you weren't like our other ma, but I don't think he believed me. James shook his head. I knew you didn't, but I was very sad that there was no snack. Louis came into the kitchen then, and she brought him a plate of eggs and bacon before sitting at the table to eat with her family. I'm really sorry I worried everyone yesterday. I meant to take a 30-minute walk to take Cassie some bread, but when I got there, she needed me. I was so caught up in the moment, I wouldn't have thought to send word where I was, even if there had been a way. We all understood what happened as soon as we realized you delivered Cassie's baby, Louis told her. I'm sorry I caused you even a moment of worry, she said, meeting Louis's eyes, but I don't give up on my commitments. I'm not leaving. Louis nodded, his face serious. I'm happy to hear that. Once the boys were on their way to school, Ruby found Louis in the parlor. We need to talk. Louis nodded once. I agree. I've thought so ever since I found that letter when I was trying to find you yesterday. There was no use beating around the bush when he could come right out and discuss what was bothering him. I got that letter on Saturday, and forgot it until Sunday, while you were out with the boys, she explained. It was never my intention to hide it from you that I'd received it or to ever write him back. Well, I may write and let him know I'm married now, but there's nothing that would entice me to go back to New York. She walked across the room and sat down beside him on the couch. I'm not going to leave you and the boys. Louis released a breath he hadn't even realized he'd been holding. You weren't hiding it from me? Of course not. I simply hadn't found the right time to tell you about it yet. I was going to tell you Sunday night, but I got distracted when we talked about the boys' reaction to your talk with them. Then we were busy Monday. So you didn't leave because of the fight we had yesterday? He asked. Fight? She thought about it for a moment, before her eyes widened with surprise. That's why I went for a walk. Walking always makes me feel better when I'm angry, though. By the time I'd reached Cassie's house, I'd completely forgotten our fight. I just wanted to give her some bread I'd baked to save her some time and energy with her time so close. I thought you had gotten angry with me and decided to go to David. I knew you had enough money saved, but when I saw your money was still in the box, and all your clothes still here, it didn't make sense that you'd left. He turned to face her, taking her hands in his. I couldn't bear it if you left me. Ruby smiled at him. Good, because I'm not going anywhere. I got that letter from David, and all I could think is that I'd had a narrow escape. He's a boy, wanting to be a man. He's fickle, and he obviously doesn't believe in commitment. I'm so glad I know that now, rather than later. He reached up and stroked his cheek. You, however, are a man. You married me when I needed someone desperately. You've been there for me every day since. Yes, we had an argument, and knowing how hot-headed I can be, I think we'll have many more. A whole lifetime of them. He sighed with relief. Are you promising to never leave us? She laughed. I'm telling you I love you, and unless you start hitting me or hurting the children, I'll stay with you forever. If you hurt the children, I'll leave you and take them with me. They're mine now. I meant my wedding vows. He froze, staring into her face. You love me? Really? Of course, I love you. She caught the back of his neck and pulled his head down for a kiss. Would I put up with you if I didn't love you? He laughed. Probably not. I love you too, you know. I think I knew I loved you when we first talked about you continuing the relationship you had with George, the previous owner. I took one look at you and started imagining you in our lives. And it made me very happy. He tapped her nose with his index finger. And then you started talking about your fiancé, David. It was always David this and David that. I got to the point I never wanted to hear his name again. She laughed. I was true to him. I didn't even notice you as a potential husband until after I got that letter from David. Of course, that should tell you that I'll never stray. You and the boys are my whole world now, Louis. Louis lowered his head, kissing her again, a bit more passionately this time. So when I ask to have a private lunch break today, you won't refuse? I'll still refuse. I promised I'd take Cassie and Tino supper tonight, so I'd have to refuse. You find a day when I haven't made plans to help someone, or finish a project, and I'll say yes. She glanced at the clock on the mantel. You know, we have a little time now. His gaze followed hers. That we do. It wouldn't make us late for work. He jumped up, grabbed her hand, and led her toward the stairs. What a brilliant idea. Late that night, she wrote her letter to David. Dear David, when I received your letter about marrying Maggie, I was devastated, and immediately looked for a way that the entire town of Nowhere wouldn't pity me for being jilted. My employer, Louis Darcy, came to my rescue. He had 2 young boys he was raising on his own, and he offered to marry me. He needed help with the boys, and he wanted me to be his wife, so I agreed. We married within 3 days of receiving your letter. The funny thing is, it took me less than 2 weeks to fall in love with him. He's a kind, gentle, loving man, and I am very happy with him. I have no intention of ever returning to Orlan, or leaving Nowhere, Texas. This is where the people I consider family are. Not only does Opal live here, but there's Cassie and Tino Hayes, and Edna Petunia and Cletus Sanders. They've all stood by me no matter what was happening in my life. You didn't. I'll never forget you, because you were my first love, and my first kiss, but I'm no longer in love with you, David. I hope your life is joyful. All the best, Ruby. Ruby read over her words and finally, she folded the letter. It would have to do. She loved her husband too much to ever be willing to entertain thoughts of her former fiancé again. Hopefully David would read the letter and move on. Louis walked into the kitchen and glanced at the letter on the table beside her. He touched it. May I? Ruby nodded. Of course. I'm not hiding anything from you. He smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. He took her hand and pulled her to her feet. You're not going to read it? He shook his head. I don't need to. It's enough to know you'd let me read it. He gripped her hand tightly, tugging her toward the stairs. Let's go tuck the boys into bed. It's not quite their bedtime yet. She had a feeling the boys wouldn't go to bed as easily as he hoped. It's past ours, he said with a wink, still tugging her along. They went into James's room first. Ruby sat down on the edge of his bed and talked to him for a moment. Thank you for hurrying home to make a snack for me, James said. I'm always happy to do it whenever I can. Ruby looked over her shoulder at Louis. What would you like for your snack tomorrow? Cookies. James told her. It was his answer every day. As long as he had cookies, all was right with his world. Cookies it is, Ruby said. She was planning on taking dinner to the Hayes one more night, but she could easily bake cookies before she left and take them some as well. She leaned down and kissed his forehead, tucking the covers in around him. Sleep sweet, James. James smiled, a look of bliss on his face. He looked at Louis. She's the best, Ma. Next they went to Robert's room, and the boy was quiet as usual. She sat on the edge of his bed, tucking the covers in around him. Thanks, Ma, he said softly. Ruby felt her heart skip a beat. He'd referred to her as his Ma, but he'd never actually called her by the name. Good night. I love you, Robert. Robert smiled, snuggling down into the pillow as she kissed his forehead. Love you, too. Louis led her into their bedroom, shutting the door firmly behind them before he pulled her to him, kissing her passionately. I love you, Ruby Darcy. I love you too. She knew she'd made the right decision to spend the rest of her life with this man and his boys. How could she ever want anything different? Epilogue. A year later, Ruby sat on the edge of the table in Dr. Harvey's office. The doctor had an odd look on her face. Is something wrong? I don't think so. Just odd. What's odd? Well, I'm hearing 2 heartbeats. I think you're having twins. Ruby sat for a moment, thinking about that. How was she going to be able to deal with both boys and infant twins? She was tired just thinking about it. Are you sure? Dr. Harvey shook her head. I can't be certain, but that's what it sounds like. Ruby smiled. If no one else is happy, my sister will be thrilled. She wants us to both have twins for our first pregnancies. I only heard one heartbeat during her last visit. But she's not quite as far along as I am. There's still hope for her. Ruby slid off the table, her stomach making every movement difficult. Make sure you're getting naps in every day, Dr. Harvey warned. I know you have the older boys and other responsibilities, but you need to take care of yourself and those babies. I will. Ruby waved as she hurried out the door. She couldn't wait to tell Louis. Instead of going to the house, she went into the store and waited while Louis finished with the customer he was talking to. How was your appointment with Dr. Harvey? He asked the first chance he got. Ruby smiled. Twins. Louis looked like he'd been hit over the head with a log. Twins? His face was white and he seemed unsteady on his feet. Twins. Ruby heard a squeal from the back of the store, and her sister came barreling at her. Twins. I'm having twins too. Are you sure? Ruby asked. Dr. Harvey thinks it's just one. I'm sure. I don't need her to confirm. We're having twins together, which is how it should be. Opal threw her arms around her sister, hugging her close. Ruby hoped Opal was right, because she could tell her sister would be crushed if she was only having one baby when she was convinced it was two. I'm glad I have my sister close. Her eyes met Louis's over her sister's shoulder. He seemed to be regaining his color. Do you want to come bake cookies with me? She asked. The boys will be home soon, and they need their snack. She and Opal left the store arm in arm. Ruby couldn't wait to hold her babies or her sister's babies. Life was always an adventure in Nowhere, Texas.